Chapter 651. After the first person surrendered, the second and third quickly followed. Following that, batches of Mongolian cavalrymen threw down their weapons and dismounted from their horses to surrender. After all, it was a team of more than 2,000 people. Even if they came out one by one to surrender, it would still take some time. After more than 2 hours, the surrender ceremony finally came to an end. At that moment, there were still about 100 men on horseback in the military camp. They were still standing there, and did not seem to be moved by Timur's words. More than 2,300 men had already surrendered. This was enough to prove Timur's position in the eyes of these cavalrymen. It made Yang Chendong see him in a new light. He was very satisfied with this number. As for the remaining 100 men, based on his perverted memory, most of them were the cavalrymen who had supported Bagan earlier. He did not know what they were thinking, but they did not surrender immediately. However, that was not important. Only by doing things one step at a time could one achieve success. Similarly, when dealing with soldiers, one had to use both the carrot and the stick to better control the hearts of the soldiers. Now, it seemed like it was time for them to show their strong and domineering side. First and second guards, get ready. Raise your guns and fire. He was still riding on the white dragon horse. When the breeze blew, his red robe fluttered gently. Following that was Yang Chendong's calm and normal voice. The two captains, Chiu Vi and Dao Xiao, tensed up the moment they were called by Yang Chendong. When they heard the order to raise their guns, their bodies could not help but cooperate. As they typed, their guns shot out beams of light and flames. Pa-pa-pa, pa-pa-pa. Before many people were ready and did not know what was going on, gunshots rang out. What entered their eyes was the scene of the Mongolian cavalrymen in the military camp falling from their horses with blood splattered all over their bodies. In the eyes of the 60 guards, there were only a little over 100 men. It did not even reach the number of enemies in one wave. When they finished off the enemy, some of the guards who were slow to react only fired one shot. They did not even have the chance to fire a second shot before everything was over. There was not a single enemy left alive in the field. More than 100 people died just like that under the not-so-dense gunfire. They didn't even have the time to react. They didn't even have the time to raise their swords, let alone dodge. There were more than 100 cavalrymen. If they were to carry out a mission, it would only take them 2 hours to slaughter a village of 500 to 600 people. But now, from the beginning to the end, all of them had died in the blink of an eye. This result shocked everyone. Not only were the 2,000 Mongol cavalrymen who had just surrendered, but there were also the 3,000 Nuzan cavalrymen and 1,000 wind-chasing group cavalrymen who were watching from the side. Even though some of them had seen the power of firearms before, what happened this time still refreshed their understanding of firearms and their respect for them from the bottom of their hearts. As a result, when some people looked at Yang Chendong, who was wearing a golden cloak, their expressions became much more solemn. They couldn't tell if it was fear, terror, respect, or worship. With the death of more than 100 people, the work of recruiting the surrendered cavalrymen was over. The next step was to count the number of people and resources. These were naturally done by professionals. Yang Chendong took advantage of this time to turn around and walk around Narcissus town. It was only a morning. To normal people, it was only a few hours, but to the people of Narcissus town, it was an earth-shattering change. This was because the 2 cavalrymen that were stationed here had fallen, and were replaced by an army called the 5-Star Army. No one would be able to avoid panic if they were suddenly led and ruled by a different person. Some cautious merchants stopped setting up their stalls, and turned around to enter their houses. They locked their doors from the inside out as if doing so would make them safer. The number of people on the streets suddenly decreased by a lot. At least 70% of the merchants in the market were gone. Only a few brave ones or those who were forced to make a living were still there. It was impossible to say that they weren't afraid, but what was the use of being afraid? Was it a blessing or a curse? Yang Chendong naturally noticed the changes on the streets, but he didn't say anything. On the other hand, Tiger's Mane, who was following beside him, said anxiously, "Young master, I'll get the soldiers to call the people out to welcome the young master." In Tiger's Mane's heart, Yang Chendong was heaven and earth. When heaven and earth appeared, naturally, the people would line the streets to welcome it. What was going on now that they were all hiding and disturbing the young master's elegance? Could these people bear the consequences? After following him for so long, how could Tiger's Mane's thoughts escape Yang Chendong's eyes? He smiled and shook his head. There's no need for that. The people don't come out because they don't understand us. Once they know our policies, they'll come out on their own. For now, let's go to the market and see if there's anything new. With a face full of confidence, Yang Chendong stopped Tiger's Mane from using military means to call for people. He walked casually and headed towards the market in the town. In an environment where the Baiming army was everywhere, there was an independent town that didn't obey the rules and had a population of more than 50,000. All of this attracted Yang Chendong's attention. He wanted to see what was the reason for this. Yang Chendong's group didn't move quickly, but they still arrived at the market after a quarter of an hour. Although it was called a market, it was actually the center of the town, a crossroad. Because the location here was very good, it was not far from any place in the town. Slowly, a certain flow of people formed here. Slowly, the embryonic form of a market was formed, and it became the most prosperous place in the town. Not knowing what the five-star army was going to do next, many merchants fled back to their houses in fear. If it wasn't for the fact that the roads leading to the outside of the town were blocked, who knows how many people would have fled with their families. But after all, it was a town with a population of 50,000. It could be called a small city anywhere. With such a large population, even if 70% of the merchants had left, this place was still very lively compared to other places. When Yang Chendong and his group appeared here, they naturally attracted everyone's attention. And when he looked back, those people turned their heads away one after another, as if they had never seen him before. The people were just curious and didn't have any intention to target him. Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei naturally couldn't blame them. In addition, the young master seemed to be very curious about this place. He had already walked to a stall and chatted with the merchant there, so they didn't dare to disturb him. The stall that Yang Chendong walked to was specialized in selling war horse pedals. There were two of them on the table, and one of them was somewhat damaged. The traces of repair were very obvious. The stall owner was a dark-skinned middle-aged man in his 30s. When he saw Yang Chendong walking towards him, it was obvious that his body trembled, but he quickly calmed down. Although his breathing was still heavy, he was already doing well. Horse pedals. Yang Chendong walked to the stall, glanced at the stall that was only about half a meter long, then looked at the things placed on it, and asked aloud, "Yes, General." The middle-aged man cupped his fist, his expression extremely dignified and serious. Of course, whether this was because he was nervous or because he was used to dealing with people like this, only he himself knew. "You also know how to repair horse pedals?" Yang Chendong asked again, then picked up the horse pedals with serious repair marks. After looking at it carefully, he nodded. "Not bad, your craftsmanship is very exquisite." After being praised and talking about his profession, the middle-aged man's nervousness subsided a lot. A smile appeared on his face, and he even said with a proud tone, "Of course, General, you can go and ask around. Who doesn't know about my Wuhua's skills? The horse pedals that I repair are no different from new ones. They are the most durable." "Well, it looks good." Yang Chendong's interest was piqued. He casually sat down on a wooden stool in front of the stall. Then he fished out a pack of cigarettes with the word "War God" written on it from his bosom. He took out 2 cigarettes, one in his mouth, and the other in front of Wu Hua. Cigarettes were manufactured by Yang Chendong during the New Year in Crimson City. Earlier, he arranged for people to plant a certain amount of tobacco on the land in Qian City, then took out the finished products from the warehouse and provided some methods to make cigarettes. In the end, the first batch of artificial cigarettes was produced. Although the quality was not as good as the machine-made cigarettes in the future, the taste was not bad. In the previous life, Yang Dong would play any role in order to complete all kinds of missions. Smoking was a common occurrence, but he was not addicted to it. Later on, when he entered the logistics line due to injury, he picked up this habit again. This time, after the production was finally completed, he habitually carried cigarettes with him. Although he would not always take them out to smoke, occasionally when he was thinking about something, It still felt good to take one out. Of course, at this time, cigarettes had become another weapon produced by Qian City. Just like the Cuban cigars in the future, the price was expensive and could be considered a luxury item. But no matter the price, once this thing appeared, it became a hot commodity. As more and more people smoked it, they felt that it was very good and trustworthy. The sales of this thing would continue to increase. Just this alone could bring about an enviable profit. Chapter 652. Let's get back to business. Wu Hua watched Yang Chendong smoke a cigarette and handed him one. After a slight hesitation, he reached out and took it. Then, he lit the cigarette with the match and took a puff like Yang Chendong. Perhaps because he used too much force, he, who had never smoked a cigarette before, involuntarily coughed violently. Then his face turned red. "Old Wu, are you okay?" "Brother Wu, how are you?" Some of the stalls nearby had been paying attention to the situation here. When they saw Wu Hua's uncomfortable appearance, several people asked with concern. From this point alone, Wu Hua's popularity was still very good. "He's fine. He just smoked a little too much. His throat is a little uncomfortable, hee." Yang Chendong answered for Wu Hua, then looked at Wu Hua with a smile and said, "Smoking is not like you. You have to take it a little bit and smoke slowly to enjoy the feeling. Of course, smoking too much of this thing is not good for the body." After a few loud coughs, Wu Hua, who had already adapted, followed Yang Chendong and took a puff gently. Then he closed his mouth and exhaled 2 puffs of smoke from his nose. He laughed. "Well, this thing is good. It's a bit strong and interesting. It's something that belongs to men. Ha ha ha." Listening to Wu Hua's evaluation, Yang Chendong laughed. Cigarettes were just one of the means he came up with to make money. In the future, he would also have a cigarette monopoly. Just this alone, he was afraid that the annual profit would not be small. As for whether it was something that belonged to men, he really did not think about it. After all, many women in the future would smoke. Although the proportion was not high, at least it proved that it should not be used by men. With cigarettes as a bridge, Wu Hua wasn't as restrained in front of Yang Chendong as before. When the two chatted, they were like old friends. They didn't hide anything from each other, but as long as it wasn't a secret, they could share it together. This was probably where the charm of cigarettes lay. It could allow two strangers to quickly get closer to each other. With the help of the cigarette, Yang Chendong found out. Wu Hua was a native of the Great Ming Dynasty. His ancestors had served as soldiers in New Er's Department of Personnel, so he was a standard soldier. However, it was too tiring to be a military carver in the Great Ming Dynasty. Regardless of whether you were suitable or not, a boy born from a military family would be a soldier from the moment he was born. Unless the girl had outstanding looks, she would most likely be married into a military family. It was as if he was unwilling to accept this fate. After scheming for a long time, Wu Hua's father escaped from the city guard institution and came to Narcissus Town. He gave birth to Wu Hua there, and the old man was no longer alive. Wu Hua was already 32 years old and had gotten used to the life here. Oh. Did Water Immortal Town exist more than 30 years ago? Yang Chendong asked with interest. Yes, it was here more than 30 years ago, but it wasn't called a town back then. It was called Narcissus Village. Because it was close to the Songhua River, people could make a living by fishing in the summer. There were also many large forests nearby, so they could mainly hunt in the winter. As long as people weren't lazy, they could survive. More and more people came here. With a cigarette, Wu Hua seemed to have become a chatterbox. He would answer whatever Yang Chendong asked. He was also very talkative and said things that Yang Chendong didn't have the time to ask, but he wanted to know more. For example, Yang Chendong understood the drawbacks of being a soldier. Regardless of whether you were willing or not, your birth represented everything. Wu Hua's father was born with a passion for blacksmithing, but he didn't become a craftsman. Instead, he became a soldier. As a result, Wu Hua inherited this trait of his father's and started working as a mechanic. For example, the various city guard institutions in New City Guard Institution were already being paid without paying. In fact, some of the city guard institutions didn't have that many soldiers. In order to get more money from the imperial court, the generals deliberately came up with this method. For example, Narcissus Town was very poor. It was so poor that many people couldn't even fill their stomachs. The most common food on the table was fish soup, but people would get sick of eating it every day. Moreover, after so many years, it was impossible to fish by the river for a good harvest. One had to go deep into the river, and that required a certain level of skill. For example, there were still many young people in Narcissus Town. Due to the pressure, many of them had been practicing martial arts and horsemanship since they were young. They were afraid that one day, someone would threaten them. That way, they wouldn't need to kill the enemy, but at least they could protect themselves. For example, after chatting with Wuxia for more than 2 hours, some of the small merchants in the surrounding area gathered their courage and joined them. Yang Chendong had to pay the price by giving each person a cigarette. Many of the people who were curious before had their cravings. From these people, Narcissus Town became more three-dimensional. Yang Chendong finally understood why a town of 50,000 people could survive the Baiming army's encirclement and remain unscathed. There was only one reason. They were too poor. They were so poor that even the Baiming army wouldn't come here to harvest grain. They were so poor that most of the young men who were born here couldn't find wives from other places. They were so poor that they would work for others as long as they were given some money. They were so poor that there were benefits to being poor. At least, that was how Yang Chendong saw it in his heart. Because he was poor, it was easier and more convenient to persuade some useful people to work for him. Because he was poor, he only needed to pay a small price to do a lot of things. He also asked Wuxia about the opinions of the townspeople towards the Nuzan cavalry and the Mongol cavalry. Wuxia was in charge of speaking, and the others added on. They talked about the 2 cavalry units. Regardless of whether it was the Nuzan cavalry or the Mongol cavalry, they weren't really made up of Nuzan and Mongol people. Many of them were originally from Narcissus Town. Because of that, they rarely bullied the townspeople because they wouldn't be supported by the cavalry. It was also because both sides had local civilians joining in that even though the Nuzan cavalry were strong, they did not really fight with the weaker Mongol cavalry. After all, the soldiers below were all their own people, and many of them grew up together. If they were to let them fight amongst themselves, the effect would not be too good. Although they couldn't bully the townspeople openly, the 2 cavalry units had done a lot of things to oppress the townspeople in secret. For example, the salary of a cavalry unit wasn't very high, and it was only enough to fill their stomachs. For example, Wuxia and the other small merchants who relied on their craftsmanship to make a living still had to pay taxes every year. The public explanation was that it was a protection fee that they collected to protect Narcissus Town from being bullied by the northern Ming guards and the nearby bandits. Yes, it wasn't a lot of money. However, to Wuxia and the others who lived at the bottom of society, even a coin of money was still money. It could save their lives in a critical moment. The more Yang Chendong listened, the brighter his eyes became. From what he understood, he already had a rough plan in his heart. Once it was done, his military strength here would rise to a whole new level. Everyone talked about a lot of things, and Yang Chendong only left the market when it was almost night time. Out of gratitude, everyone who chatted with him today received a piece of fat meat and 5 taels of silver. That was a big piece of fat meat that weighed at least 3 catties, and 5 taels of silver. They could save it for when they went to the nearby Baiming towns to buy what they needed. This made Wuxia and the others extremely touched. However, something even more shocking happened after dinner that night. Most of the townspeople had the guts to go out for a walk, because they realized that the 5-star army was easy to talk to. At least, they didn't threaten the safety of the townspeople. They didn't even say anything harsh, which made them feel more at ease. It was the 5-star army that was in charge of patrolling the streets that night. They spread the news that there would be a public trial in the town's largest square the next morning. They would judge the past of the Nuzan cavalry and the Mongol cavalry. If they were guilty of any wrongdoings, they would be judged and executed on the spot to give the townspeople justice. The news spread like a gust of wind into the ears of the townspeople who were walking on the streets. Then, through their mouths, it spread to the townspeople's homes. According to the 5-star army, they hoped that the townspeople would be able to attend the public trial tomorrow morning. Those who were wronged could seek redress on the spot, and those who weren't wronged could also go and watch the show. Because of this news, Narcissus Town, which had a population of 50,000, instantly became lively. Many of the townspeople didn't go out for a walk and went home early to rest so that they could wake up early the next morning and grab a good spot in the square to take a good look at what this public trial was all about. Was it really as the news said? Would they be able to make a decision for them and compensate them? Yes, it was compensation. The news said that if anyone was bullied before, as long as they could prove it, the 5-star army would compensate them with silver from the Nuzan cavalry and the Mongol cavalry's warehouses. Of course, if someone wanted to falsely claim the money, it would be the same as committing a crime, and they would be severely punished. How many people who lived in Narcissus Town hadn't been exploited and oppressed before? This was closely related to everyone, so naturally, there were many people who were concerned about it. As for falsely claiming the money, haha, they did think about it. However, when they found out that it was a serious crime, they gave up on the idea. The gunshots yesterday weren't firecrackers. They heard that more than 100 people died. It was murder, and blood flowed like a river. Were they tired of living and greedy for this kind of money? Under all kinds of thoughts, the sun slowly rose, and a new day had arrived. In the morning, many of the townspeople didn't even eat breakfast. They brought their things to the square and found a good spot to wait. The time was set at 9 in the morning. But in fact, before 8 o'clock, more than 30,000 people had gathered in the square. In this way, except for the elderly and the young children, more than 80% of the people with independent ability had come out. This could already achieve a great influence. Chapter 653. Yang Chendong listened to Tiger's Mane's report as he walked out of Borte's spacious house. Yang Chendong smiled when he heard that there were more than 30,000 people. Their first step was already so successful. As long as everything went smoothly, they would become stronger. At 9 o'clock in the morning, it was time for the trial. 5-star army soldiers wearing green uniforms started to appear around the square. Along with them were Yang Chendong and a group of high-ranking military officers wearing golden capes. They walked to the front of the square and sat down in front of the row of tables and chairs that had been set up beforehand. Beside them stood a group of guards and members of the Cold Front. They were wearing bulletproof vests and wielding the Type 95. Compared to the heavy armor that other armies wore to protect themselves, the mercenaries wore bulletproof vests that were invulnerable and looked much lighter than armor. These vests were replicas of the bulletproof vests in the warehouse. They were produced by the factory in Crimson City. Legend had it that in order to ensure the quality and characteristics of the vests, they had spent tens of millions of taels of silver and countless manpower to develop them. Even so, the cost of making a bulletproof vest was still very high. Up until now, only the members of the Cold Front who had undergone strict training and tests were allowed to wear one. Even the auxiliary soldiers were not allowed to wear one. It was just a piece of protective clothing. Just the research and development alone cost close to 10 million taels of silver. This was equivalent to 3 years of Northern Ming or Southern Ming's national treasury's income. Just from this alone, one could see that Yang Shi was extremely wealthy. Of course, the benefits of having these vests were self-explanatory. Unless the target was the eyes or mouth, it would be very difficult to hurt the Cold Front. This was because not only were they wearing bulletproof vests, but they were also wearing a helmet called Kevlar. Yang Chendong personally named it the Immortal Helmet. With the appearance of the undying helmets and bulletproof vests, the personal safety of the Cold Vanguard warriors was raised to a whole new level. It was easy to imagine how powerful and stunning they would be on the battlefield. After all, Narcissus Town had been ruled by the Jurchens and Mongolians for so long. No one could be sure that there were no extremists in the town. This highlighted the importance of the guards and the Cold Front, not to mention the existence of the 6th young master. His safety would always be Yang Xie's #1 priority. It would not be too much to arrange for many people to appear on both sides. The residents of Narcissus Town naturally felt a chill down their spines when they saw the generals and the soldiers that appeared so majestic. Although these people looked calm and did not show any intention of threatening their safety, they still felt a natural chill in the air wherever they sat. This caused the citizens who were chattering nonstop to shut their mouths. And the place became quiet. Chunbo, the political commissar of the 3rd Regiment who was ordered to host the meeting, saw this silence and was naturally very satisfied. Using this opportunity, he held a simple megaphone and shouted, "I hereby announce the start of the public trial. The first item is to fire a shot to salute the citizens of Narcissus Town who were murdered or wronged. May their souls be at peace after today's meeting. All musketeers listen up. Fire 3 times. Fire." Bang, 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 bang. A company of cold front soldiers stood at the side of the square. After the order was given, they all raised their guns and fired at the sky. Their formation was extremely neat and uniform. It felt as if the 100 of them were one person. Not only were their movements orderly, but even the frequency and speed of their shots were the same. Although it was 100 people firing, when the sound reached the ears of the people in the square, the gunshots were very uniform. It was as if there were only 3 gunshots, and everything was over. Wow. So powerful. So mighty. How did they do it? There are so many of them, but it feels as if they are one person. Is this the 5-star army? No wonder the awe-inspiring Nuzan cavalry and Mongol cavalry couldn't even last one round in front of them. With this kind of army, with this kind of military discipline, how can they not win a battle? Hey, you guys still don't know. This 5-star army is very powerful. They don't even put the beaming guards in their eyes. Not long ago, they massacred more than 2,000 warhorses of the Jianzhou left guards. Their slogan is to create the strongest cavalry in the world. I heard that as long as one can join them, they will receive the best treatment. Not only will their salary be the highest, but they will also receive the best food. In the future, each person will even be given 2 warhorses. The people in front sighed from the bottom of their hearts. Those who spoke at the back were those who were more attentive. If someone observed carefully, they would notice that Wuxia, who was in charge of riding in the center of the town, was among them. Not only him, but there were also some people who specialized in selling all kinds of things, and had some craftsmanship. Most of them were the people who chatted with Yang Qindong for most of the afternoon with Wuxia. It was naturally not a coincidence that they appeared here. They were ordered by Yang Qindong to bewitch the people here. Their purpose was to spread the news that the 5-star army was recruiting people. Since there were 50,000 people here who were ownerless, and there were more than 8,000 young adults here, how could Yang Qindong give up such a good opportunity to expand his strength? This was the reason why Wuxia and the others spread the news. As for whether they received benefits from Yang Qindong, and how much they received, only they knew. Oh, what kind of treatment is it? When someone spoke, there would naturally be people who asked. Some people were curious. As a result, all kinds of questions were naturally asked in various parts of the square. After the public trial, the 5-star army will set the recruitment standards. At that time, the treatment will be explained in detail. If you want to know more, go take a look. In any case, I will be there. As for now, let's continue watching the public trial. This was Wuxia's voice. Although he had received some benefits and had to spread the news, he also knew what kind of situation this was. He would not let the guest take the lead. Thus, he only said that after the public trial, the 5-star army would have a recruitment notice. After that, he stopped talking and focused all of his attention on the center of the square. Wuxia did not speak. In addition, the atmosphere was indeed very tense. Even if someone wanted to ask, it would not be good to say anything at this time. They could only suppress all kinds of thoughts in their hearts and watch the public trial first. After everything was over, they would go take a good look at the notice and see what was written on it. The center of the crowd quickly quieted down again. Among them, a man wearing a broken straw hat lowered his head and intentionally or unintentionally squeezed out of the crowd. Compared to everyone who wanted to get closer, it was very easy to retreat. He didn't even encounter any resistance. He left the crowd and then disappeared from the square. His actions were not noticed by the mercenaries who were in charge of security and security. There were more than 30,000 people here. It was simply too many. It was impossible to take care of everyone. After the man left the square, he first returned to a small courtyard. After making sure that no one was paying attention to him, he entered the house and came in front of a water jar that was only filled with a little water. He stretched out his arm and gently moved it, revealing a passage on the ground. He jumped down and placed the water jar back on the ground. He also disappeared. After about half an hour, this person appeared 5 miles northwest of Narcissus town. At this moment, he finally regained his freedom and could finally throw the hat to the ground, revealing his true identity. He was one of the Nuzan cavalry generals who had quietly disappeared when he saw that the situation was not good. When Huilibu saw that he did not recognize the cavalry that followed General Borte, he knew that things were not going well. He left first and went into hiding. Things were just as he thought. Borte and the others were indeed in trouble. Thus, he had been hiding under the water tank at home. Occasionally, when he came out at night, he would move around a bit. That was how he found out about the public trial. Today, he had taken the risk to appear because he wanted to take advantage of the large number of people to inquire about some things. Defeat. This was already an irrefutable fact. However, he wanted to know how they were defeated. Who were their opponents? How strong were they? In order to find out, he risked his life to come out. After hearing what Wu Hua and the others said, he was satisfied with the answer. The 5-star army dared to go against the Baiming guards and stole more than 2,000 war horses. Just based on this, they were doomed. This was something that even the Nuzan and Mongol cavalry did not dare to do. He thought that he had found out a huge piece of information. After coming out of the tunnel, he identified the direction and headed towards the Saha River northwest of Narcissus town. That was the nearest Baiming 1,000 households. He wanted to inform them of the 5-star army's actions. After this incident, Baiming would definitely not let the 5-star army off. When 2 tigers fought, one was bound to be injured. If he grasped the opportunity, it might be time for him to lead the Nuzan cavalry to rise again. Huilibu did not leave and left quietly. At this moment, the public trial was in full swing in the largest square of Narcissus town. The first rule of the public trial was to fire the gun. It was to show off one's strength and also to pay respect to the victims. At that time, people were very superstitious. They believed that a person's soul would remain after death. Those who died unjustly would not leave unless they took revenge. Now that the gun was fired, it was equivalent to using this superstition to let the 5-star army take the rightful position. Chapter 654. The second item was to collect the silver. Following the capture of Borte, Bagan, and the other generals, the silver that was controlled by the Jurchen and Mongol cavalry had become one of the spoils of war. A lot of money was taken out from there. At this moment, the 5-star army brought them out and gathered them together in the square. Very quickly, a mountain of silver appeared in everyone's sight, shining with a silver light. Many people's eyes were filled with excitement. Due to Narcissus town's unique location and environment, the people here were all very poor. Sometimes they couldn't even settle their meals, let alone have any savings at home. Now that so much silver was placed in front of everyone, it would be a lie to say that no one was moved, especially when they knew that the silver would be given to the victims as compensation. Some people's eyes lit up. No matter how good the words were, no matter how good the guarantees were, it was not as convincing as a mountain of silver. For a moment, the entire square was filled with a restless mood. If it wasn't for the fact that there was a company of fully armed cold spear warriors guarding the silver mountain, who knew how many people would have rushed up and snatched the silver mountain clean. The appearance of the mountain of silver also stirred up everyone's emotions. At this moment, the public trial was proceeding as usual. The third item was to bring people to commit crimes. Borte and Hulu of the Jurchen tribe, as well as Bagan and Momu, of the Mongol cavalry, were brought to the square. There was already a wooden rack with names written on it. After these people appeared, they were tied to the wooden rack according to their names. Their hands were tied, and their heads drooped. Their bodies were not free at all, and they did not look like generals at all. This was especially true for General Bagan. His left arm had been chopped off due to his resistance, but the bleeding had stopped. However, due to the excessive loss of blood, his face was as pale as snow. Now that he saw the scene of the public trial, he was trembling all over, trembling uncontrollably. Not only him, but the other generals were not much better. Perhaps because they knew that they had bullied the good too many times and were about to receive retribution. They did not look too good. None of them dared to raise their heads, as if they were afraid that they would be targeted. Only the Jurchen General Hulu and the Mongol General Teimu had their chests puffed out as they looked at the 30,000 people outside the square. They were all straightforward people who fought bravely and fiercely. They were the kind of people who didn't have too many schemes. Being able to become a general wasn't because of his eloquence or flattery. It was because he was strong enough that he was recognized by Borte and Bagan, and was given a high position. Their personalities would not allow them to do anything that would harm or bully the people, so they were the most calm at this moment. But no matter what, they were generals of the two armies. Even with their high positions, they could not escape responsibility. Even though they looked calm, they were already dead. After all, according to what they knew, how many defeated generals would have a good ending? In fact, the generals were not the only ones who did not know what was going on. Even the 30,000 people who came did not know what was going on. They only thought that it was like an execution at the market. Since they were the defeated army's generals, they would definitely die. Only when political commissar Chunbo stood up and began to read the process of the public trial did everyone know. The public trial meant that the people would judge the evildoers together. As for whether the kidnapped people were guilty or not, it would be up to the people to decide. When Chunbo conveyed the meaning of the public trial through the loudspeaker, the square became even more lively. All along, the people were made up of the lowest class of people. Under normal circumstances, they were the people who were exploited, used, and suffered. If there was something good, it would rarely have anything to do with them. On the other hand, if there was a need to put an effort or risk their lives, it would naturally be their turn. This might seem very unfair, but this was the norm in a feudal society. For thousands of years, the people had become accustomed to it. On the contrary, there would occasionally be one or two officials who would plead for the people. They would be seen as honest officials, and things like giving people umbrellas and so on would happen again and again. Thinking about it, it was sad. The officials only did what they should do, and the people would be so grateful. It had to be said that this was the world's biggest joke. The people were used to listening to others, used to being oppressed by others. Suddenly they could make decisions. This made them feel uncomfortable. A group of people huddled together and chattered. They did not dare to believe, and did not dare to believe. Chunbo had already expected such a scene. Seeing this, he could not help but envy the people of Qian City. Compared to them, the people there not only had a higher quality of life, but they also had more human rights. Once they encountered injustice, they could respond step by step and finally be dealt with properly. Although it was said that there were no absolutes in the world, and not everyone could obtain the ideal outcome when encountering injustice, but most people still received the respect of human rights. At the very least, if there was a public trial in Qian City, the people there would not be so agitated. They would even take it for granted. This was the difference. And this small difference, who knew how many years it would take for others to catch up, before they could truly accept it, and change their mindset. After being distracted for a moment, Chunbo's gaze returned to the 30,000 people in front of him. Using the loudspeaker, he shouted, "Could it be that none of you have been oppressed or bullied? As long as you can provide the corresponding evidence or find a witness, then we will make the decision for you. Do you see that mountain of silver? As long as what you say is the truth, the silver there will become compensation and fall into your hands. Now, I invite those who have been wronged to step forward and tell our staff about the injustice that happened to you. Believe in us, believe in yourselves. Justice is in the hearts of the people." In any case, Chunbo was the political commissar of the 3rd Regiment. During this period, he had read many books and learned many things. Now that it was finally time to put it to good use, he immediately used his glib tongue and tried his best to bewitch the people with words. He firmly believed that as long as one person was persuaded and dared to step forward, there would be tens of thousands of people who would step forward. In reality, there was no need for Chunbo to say too much. Wu Hua and the others had already stepped forward. They were a step ahead of everyone else and knew what was going on with this public trial. Under the circumstances where they had communicated beforehand, They walked out of the crowd and walked over to the row of mercenaries who had set up the tables at the side of the plaza. I want to report. I'm talking about the Jurchen Borte. My family has an ancestral jade pendant. It was accidentally seen by him and was forcibly taken away. That pendant should still be on his waist now. I want to report that the Mongolian Bagan once took a fancy to my horse and only offered 5 taels of silver. I refused and was beaten up by him. Now, that horse is still in the Mongolian camp stable. I want to report that Borte had bad intentions towards my wife. One time, when I was out hunting, he did something inhumane. In order to protect her chastity, my wife bit her tongue and died on the spot. I didn't dare to tell anyone about my return, but this matter has been in my heart for many years. If I don't take revenge, I really don't have the face to see my wife in the afterlife. Now, I want the 5-star army to make a decision for me. Everyone in the neighborhood knows about this matter. Please make a decision for me. I want to report. With the first person to step forward as an example, more and more people took the initiative to step forward. They each spoke of the various grievances they had suffered, each with evidence or witnesses. Every time someone came forward to report, the mercenaries would constantly record it on paper. The auxiliary soldiers who followed them would immediately investigate and try to get to the bottom of the matter. For example, the jade pendant was indeed found on Borte's body, so it naturally had to be returned to its rightful owner. The horse with the same characteristics was also found in the stable and returned to its rightful owner. As for the deceased wife, she couldn't be found, so they took out 20 taels of silver from the silver mountain. Although the amount wasn't much, it was enough to build a new grave and even hang a chastity memorial arch. As more and more people came forward to report the crimes of Borte Bagan, and the others were reported to the world one by one, more and more people came forward to report. On the other hand, Hulu and Temu were rarely prosecuted. Although there were some people who came forward to say that the two of them had done something wrong, there was insufficient evidence after investigation. There was even one who was clearly falsely accusing them and wanted to take the opportunity to gain benefits. After being investigated, the commoner was severely warned by the mercenaries. When the forest was big, there were all kinds of birds. Although the commoners were at the bottom of the social ladder, there were still some who wanted to use this opportunity to make a fortune. Yang Chendong had already thought of this. Once such people were discovered, it was natural for him to give them a warning. If it wasn't for the fact that these people weren't under his rule, they would have been punished for their actions. The public hearing went smoothly. Most of the commoners who came forward to sue had evidence and reason. Plus, the incident happened in Narcissus town, so the investigation wasn't too complicated. Even so, it still took them 3 days to finish listening to all the pleadings of the citizens. This was because there were more than 100 staff members in charge of reception, and 4 battalions of auxiliary soldiers working together. Otherwise, it would have taken even longer. Chapter 655. 3 days later, the silver disappeared. It was all given out as compensation. The 5-star army had truly become a protective force that cared for the citizens of Narcissus town. On the same morning, the final item of the joint trial, the sentencing, it officially began. Chen Bo was still the one presiding over the meeting. In his hand, he held a statistical report of the 3 days since the public trial. Using the loudspeaker, he read it out loud. Borte was indicted for 17,832 crimes. After verification, he was found to have been an accomplice for 17,725 crimes. Due to his heinous crimes, he was sentenced to the punishment of death by 1,000 cuts. Bagan was indicted for 15,347 crimes. After verification, he was found to have been an accomplice for 14,628 crimes. Due to his heinous crimes, he was sentenced to the punishment of death by 1,000 cuts. Centurion Zhang Maoshi was indicted for. The loud and clear voice kept ringing in the air above the square. The people whose names were called had a look of despair on their faces. At that moment, even death had become a kind of happiness because they still had to go through thousands of cuts before they could close their eyes and die. As the crimes were read out, the first cry was heard in the square. Then, more and more cries were heard. These were the spontaneous cries of the people who had suffered, and been wronged. Originally, they thought that they would never be able to get justice for the injustice that happened to them. However, the Five-Star Army came and helped them solve everything. At this moment, in their hearts, the Five-Star Army was like their parents who had given them a new lease of life. At this moment, they were probably willing to do anything that was asked of them. Of course, not all generals were sentenced to death. For example, Hulu and Taimuching were special cases. The only reason they were sentenced to death was because they had beaten and scolded the soldiers under them. It was also because they expected better from the soldiers, so it wasn't considered a crime at all. Even though Yang Chendong didn't advocate corporal punishment, there were still some recruits who liked it. It was useless to reason with such people. Sometimes, the effect of a kick was better than 1,000 words of warning and education. Therefore, even in Yang Xie's army, as long as it wasn't targeted and the veterans didn't make things difficult for the new recruits, the higher-ups would tacitly approve of some corporal punishment. Of course, the prerequisite was that the person couldn't be crippled. If that was the case, all the officers involved would be implicated. It was precisely because Hulu and Taimu didn't commit any serious mistakes that they, as defeated generals, were only given 3 lashes each. This was the same as overlooking the fact that they had beaten the soldiers. Of course, these 3 whips also meant that they had severed all ties with the past. It meant that from today onwards, they were no longer part of the Jurchens and Mongol cavalry. Instead, they were part of the mercenaries. At this moment, Yang Chendong was meeting the 2 of them in a large hall to talk about this matter. Over the past 3 to 4 days, although the 2 generals would be tied up and sent to the square early in the morning, they still understood what the mercenaries were like. This was a quality that a general must have, which was to be good at observation. It was precisely because of what they saw and observed that they admired the mercenaries from the bottom of their hearts. In their opinion, if their side had achieved such a great victory, it would have been impossible for them to enter Narcissus town without disturbing or bullying the citizens. Not to mention, over the past 3 to 4 days, not only did the mercenaries not harm a single civilian, they even went into the homes of the civilians after training to chop firewood, fetch water, and do other things within their capabilities. This kind of army had never appeared since ancient times. It was precisely because of this that they quickly won the hearts of the people of Narcissus town. As a result, many people were thinking that it would be best if the Five-Star Army stayed here forever and never left. Being personally received by Yang Chendong already proved the value of the 2 generals. Originally, the 2 of them didn't like some of Borte's and Bagan's methods. Now that the 2 of them were still being tortured in the square, death was inevitable, and there would be a painful process. So, where should the 2 of them go from here? Yang Chendong's appearance expressed his intention to recruit them. With sincerity, the 2 generals only hesitated for a moment before kneeling down and calling him the 6th young master. This meant that from this moment onwards, they had completely joined the mercenaries' camp. Whether it was Hulu or Taimu, they were both quite strong. However, they were only not bad. It would be a lie to say that they were military geniuses. The reason why Yang Chendong was willing to come was because of their understanding of the local situation and their role as role models among the Jurchens and Mongol cavalry. This time, they had captured 7,000 captives. Among them, there were 3,500 Jurchens and 2,500 Mongol cavalry. These were all people who dealt with war horses all year round. These soldiers only needed a little training before they could go on the battlefield. Naturally, the more such soldiers the better. Not only these 7,000 captives, Yang Chendong also had no intention of letting the 8,000 strong men in Narcissus town go. If possible, of course, he wanted to recruit them as subordinates. The more the better. Before doing this, he wanted to ask for Hulu and Taimuer's opinion. After all, they were the local bullies. They should understand the situation better than he did. This was also the main reason why Yang Chendong wanted to meet the 2 of them. Both Hulu and Taimu naturally wanted to perform well and leave a good impression on their commander. At that moment, the 2 of them spoke one after another. From the 2 of them, Yang Chendong learned about the situation between the Jurchens and the Mongol army. For example, the Jurchens were divided into two types, the Jurchens and the matured Jurchens. Under normal circumstances, the matured Jurchens were more inclined towards the Han people because they had lived with them for many years. The Jurchens, on the other hand, were more fond of war and conquest. This was why the Jurchens were mostly the Jurchens who ruled. For example, Borte was one of the representatives of the Jurchens. In Narcissus Town, it was the exact opposite. There were more matured Jurchens. If it wasn't for the harsh living conditions, most of them wouldn't have joined the army and would have lived a simple life like the Han people. This was Hulu's analysis as a member of the Jurchens. Next, the Mongol general Teimu, talked about Mongolia. Mongolia was just a general term. After the fall of northern Yuan in 1402, Mongolia was divided into many tribes. Later on, it gradually formed into three major tribes according to the area they lived in. The Mongols who lived in the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, and the three northeastern provinces were called the Southern Desert Mongols, or the Horkin tribe. The Mongols who lived in present-day Mongolia were called the Northern Desert Mongols, or the Khalkha tribe. The Mongols who lived in Xinjiang, Qinghai, and Gansu were called the Western Desert Mongols, or the Oirat tribe. Between the three major tribes there were many smaller tribes. They would often have disputes over territory and interests, which led to all kinds of wars. In short, there was only one word to describe it: chaos. Often, two small tribes that had a good relationship with each other yesterday might suddenly start fighting against each other today after they had just reached an alliance. For example, Bagan was once the son of a small tribe's chief. Because his tribe was annexed by others, he had no choice but to bring some of his remaining soldiers to Narcissus Town and develop there. Previously, Borte had been worried that if he touched Bagan, the Mongolian cavalry would retaliate. That was simply impossible. He was just scaring himself. Or rather, Bagan was a person who knew how to take advantage of the situation. Whether it was Hulu's or Teimuer's words, it was consistent with the investigation report sent by the Security Bureau. This proved that the two of them had no intention of playing tricks with him. Yang Chendong was naturally very happy. He blurted out, "Based on your opinions, if I wanted to recruit and expand my army here, how many people would be willing to join the 5-star army?" In order not to attract the attention of Baiming, Wala, or even the Mongolians, Yang Chendong planned to use the name of the 5-star army before he developed enough strength in this area. Once the time was right or he couldn't hide it anymore, he would use the name of mercenaries again. In order to set an example, Yang Chendong naturally only mentioned the 5-star army when he spoke. After saying that, he looked at Hulu and Teimu, with a smile, waiting for their reply. In his heart, he honestly didn't care about the revenge of the Jurchens and the Mongolian cavalry. He would just deal with whatever came his way. Other than the fact that he didn't have enough military strength, he was already ahead of other armies in all other aspects. What was there to be afraid of? No problem. Facing this question, Hulu and Teimu didn't hesitate at all. They were even a little excited when they answered the question. Although it was true that they had decided to join the 5-star army, and with their bravery, it shouldn't be a problem for them to become an officer. However, if they could recruit more captives and civilians from Narcissus Town and let them join the army, it would be more beneficial for them to quickly establish their prestige since they were already familiar with each other. After all, everyone was familiar with each other. If they wanted to achieve the goal of taking care of each other, who would look for strangers when there were people they were familiar with? Haha, good. Yang Chendong nodded in satisfaction. He could see through Hulu and Teimuer's thoughts, but he didn't care. As long as these thoughts didn't affect the overall situation, he would allow them to exist. Since that's the case, I'll have to trouble the two of you to cooperate with Commander Wu Sheng, Political Commissar Chen Bo, and Commander Zhui Feng in recruiting soldiers. Chapter 656. Yang Chendong did indeed want to recruit soldiers. Not only that, he also wanted to establish a cavalry division. After obtaining so many war horses, he felt that the time was ripe. What army was the strongest in the grasslands? Naturally, it would be the cavalry. He naturally wanted to cooperate and establish a powerful cavalry force. The cavalry division would be temporarily held by Wuxia, and Chen Bo would be the political commissar. The Windchaser Cavalry Regiment also needed to be expanded. However, it wasn't suitable to establish a cavalry division at the moment. It would be called the Cavalry Reinforced Regiment for now. The number of soldiers under it was equivalent to 2 cavalry regiments. It could be considered below a division and above a regiment. In fact, this unit could also be called a brigade. However, Yang Qindong didn't want to go through so much trouble. He might as well just create a cavalry reinforced regiment. Now that the main theme had been set, the next step was to recruit soldiers. Because of the previous 3 days of public trial, and the fact that the 5-star army had already gotten along well with the commoners during this period of time, their relationship was extremely good. Naturally, there wouldn't be any problems with the recruitment of soldiers. On the contrary, because there were too many applicants, they had no choice but to use the method of selecting the best. Compared to the other armies that needed to recruit strong men from all over the place and promise them great benefits in order to barely gather enough soldiers, this kind of upsurge of people signing up to join the army would definitely make those people jealous if they knew about it. This was the use of role models. This was the use of words and example. When you truly saw the commoners as human beings and gave them the respect and dignity they deserved, you would discover that their cute side would be revealed. They would truly think for you and be willing to give you everything they had. Of course, this was also related to the generosity of the 5-star army. Compared to the recruitment of the Nuzan and Mongol cavalry, the monthly salary was only 2 taels of silver and 5 kilograms of meat. Later on, the Mongol army purposely increased the salary to 5 taels of silver and 20 kilograms of meat. The 5-star army directly gave out 10 taels of silver. Once they proved that their fighting ability had reached the first rank, the salary would be increased to 15 taels of silver. This was equivalent to 5 times the original salary. The treatment was good, and they could obtain respect. In addition, the 5-star army had just gotten justice for everyone. This caused the craze of people signing up to join the army to become extraordinarily lively. Out of the 7,000 cavalrymen who were captured, 6,500 of them were willing to join the 5-star army. Out of the 8,000 strong men in Narcissus Town, 7,500 of them signed up. That was to say, as long as Yang Qindong was willing to accept all of them, the number of new soldiers would increase by 14,000. Based on the calculation of 400 soldiers per battalion, there would be an additional 35 battalions. If it were any other army or force, they would definitely be very happy. However, in Yang Qindong's eyes, he did not have the intention to take over all of them. What he wanted were elite soldiers who could fight, and not an ordinary army that was just there to make up the numbers. Luo Po's 2nd Cold Front Regiment remained in Laos and Vietnam, preparing to expand into 2nd Cold Front Regiment. Based on this foundation, Yang Qindong made preparations to expand Wuxiang's 3rd Regiment into a cavalry division. There would be 3 regiments under his command, and each regiment would be expanded from the original 4 battalions to 5 battalions. The 5th battalion would be the preparatory battalion. In this way, the number of people in a regiment would be 1,600. 3 regiments plus a division of 400 men. In total there were about 5,200 men. Other than the cavalry division, there was also a need to build a reinforced cavalry regiment. Zhui Feng and Lu Zhuo would be the commanders of the 1st and 2nd regiments. Since it was a reinforced regiment, the organization of the regiment naturally had to be strengthened as well. A battalion would be divided into 6 companies, so 3 battalions would be a total of 1,800 people, including the 2 companies directly under the regiment. A reinforced regiment would have a total of 2,000 people. 2 reinforced regiments would have 4,000 people. The original 6 auxiliary battalions would become an independent regiment with a total of 2,400 people. For the time being, Yang Qindong would personally lead it, and Tiger's Mane would be the regiment commander. In this way, 1 cavalry division had 5,200 people, 2 cavalry regiments had a total of 4,000 people, and 1 auxiliary soldier had a total of 2,400 people. In total, there were about 11,600 people. This was already not a small force and not a weak force. In order to fulfill this condition, he would need to recruit 6,600 people. This meant that out of the 14,000 people who signed up, he would only accept 6,600 new recruits. This meant that he would have to eliminate more than half of the people. When the news came out, the middle-aged and middle-aged men of Narcissus Town were stunned. Then, all of them worked hard to perform well and fight for the chance to join the 5-star army. Although the 5-star army was different from other armies, and they even rejected people who signed up, didn't this mean that they were strong? An army that accepted all kinds of people might seem to have a lot of people, but when it came to war, they wouldn't be as strong and powerful as they looked. On the other hand, the 5-star army was the true representative of strength. One must know that not everyone was like them, who dared to say no to the middle-aged men who wanted to join the army. The order was given by Yang Chendong, so naturally no one would object. Next was the conscription test. The examiners would set the questions, which were horsemanship test, horsemanship battle, and strength on land. Everyone wanted to perform well. After all, if they could join the 5-star army, not only would it be a chance to prove themselves, but it would also give them an enviable monthly salary. There would be face and benefits, so naturally, everyone would fight to the death. Sacha River City. Sacha River was only a small town next to the Songhua River. However, due to its special geographical location, there was still a Baiming Qianhu. Qianhu Wei's surname was Yila. He was a standard Nuzan tribe member, and belonged to the Nuzan branch. At this moment, Yila was receiving Hui Libu, who escaped from Narcissus Town in his Qianhu residence. Everyone was a Nuzan and belonged to the Nuzan branch, so naturally, they kept in contact. Hui Libu would even come to Sacha River to deliver gifts under General Borte's orders during the holidays. However, this time he came alone. He didn't even ride a horse. Yila was very curious about Hui Libu's sudden arrival and his down-and-out appearance. However, when he heard about what happened in Narcissus Town, Yila couldn't help but frown. After some time he asked in a very serious tone, "You said that the 5-star army stole 2,000 war horses from the Jian province left guard. Is that true? I know you want to return to Narcissus Town for revenge, but please remember that some things can't be said carelessly. Not only will you lose your head, but you will also implicate the Nuzan people in the army." General Yi, I can vouch for this with my head. The 5-star army was the one who stole the Jian province left guard. This is no secret in Narcissus Town. She puffed out her chest and raised her head. She didn't have the slightest intention of backing down. She patted her chest and made a promise. He stared at Hui Libu seriously, but the latter's gaze was still as resolute as ever. Finally, Yila let out a long sigh. "Alright, if what you said is true, then this is equivalent to making a great contribution to Northern Ming. I will immediately report this matter to the higher-ups. Once the 5-star army is eliminated, the territory of Narcissus Town will be yours." "Thank you, General." Hui Libu's face was filled with joy and excitement. He didn't forget to make a promise. "Don't worry, General. Once I take control of Narcissus Town, the previous rules won't change. I still have to rely on your help." The so-called rules naturally referred to the filial piety during festivals. However, Yila didn't care about that at this moment. He was thinking about how to use this matter to raise his status in the new Ergon Dusi region, and how to expand his power. Female Zhenren, especially Xingnu Zhenren, were naturally good at fighting. The generals of Baiming had already seen this. Therefore, more and more female Zhenrens were being promoted. Some became Baihu, some became Vice Qianhu, and Yila became a Major Qianhu. It seemed that a Major Qianhu would have a bright future. However, only he knew how difficult it was for a female Zhenren to squeeze into the group of people with the highest authority. To do this, not only did he need the support of nobles, but he also needed enough military achievements. The appearance of the 5-star army seemed to give him an opportunity. If possible, perhaps he could use this matter to help him reach a higher position. It was no wonder that Yila thought this way. In history, more than 100 years ago, Nurhasai, who was born in the Jian province left guard commander's family, used the 13 sets of armor left behind by his ancestors to start his journey of establishing a country and becoming a Khan. This person's ancestor was once a high-ranking official in the Ming army. It could be said that Yi Le's idea was correct. Unfortunately, this time he was going to face the mercenaries, and the mercenaries personally led by Yang Chendong, which would be destined to be a futile effort. Of course, he didn't know this at the moment. After receiving the uncertain information, he immediately informed the nearby guard stations, especially the Jian Province Left Guard, who immediately sent out scouts to inform them. Not only that, Yi Le also contacted the vice Qianhu of the Taining Guard, Lu Dai, who was closer to him. This person was also a female Zhenren. He wanted to go to Narcissus Town with this person. If there was a chance, they would take down the 5-star army in one fell swoop. If not, they would join forces with the Jian Province Left Guard to attack the 5-star army. As the scouts rode out of the city, the southwest area of the new Urgan metropolis became lively. A large net that covered and targeted the 5-star army slowly unfolded. Some people said that the new Urgan metropolis was a recruitment organization sent out by the Liaodong metropolis. This organization's mission was to recruit the female Zhenren tribe. Whether or not there was a metropolis didn't affect the Ming dynasty's control over the various guard stations. In some people's eyes, the new Urgan metropolis was just an administrative area. It wasn't even an organization. Chapter 657. Was that right? Yes and no. Yes, that was because history had indeed developed this way. However, with the appearance of Yang Chendong, history had already deviated from its original path. Baiming's emperor, Zhu Qiyu, had only limited his influence to the north. This gave him more energy to control the new, Urgan Dusi region. Ever since Zhu Qiyu started doing this, not only did Baiming's control over this place become stronger, but the garrison here was no longer useless. The number of soldiers had also increased by a lot. This made this place Baiming's recruitment warehouse. If there was a war with the southern Ming Empire one day, there would be an endless stream of soldiers being sent to the front lines. However, such a conscription warehouse was actually tricked by someone else. It was imaginable how furious the generals of the various guard posts would be when they heard this news. This was no longer riding on a tiger's head, but riding on a tiger's head and shitting on it. This was intolerable. Yella also saw through this, so when he spread the news, a huge net had been set up to target the 5-star army. A huge war was unavoidable. Narcissus Town. After 3 days of public hearings and 7 days of conscription examinations, 6,600 new recruits had been selected, and were officially assigned to the various divisions and battalions. More than 6,000 people had joined all of a sudden. This number was much more than the original mercenary army and 5-star army. This unavoidably lowered the 5-star army's combatability, and even pushed the mercenary army, which was a first-class army, down to a second-class army. This was the pain of expanding the army. It was unavoidable. Fortunately, with Yang Chendong's leadership, as long as they went through the baptism of war, he believed that the 5-star army would definitely shine brightly and become a first-class army again. After staying in Narcissus Town for 12 days, the team of close to 12,000 people finally had to leave. Before he left, Yang Chendong left behind many weapons he had seized from the Borte tribe and Bagan tribe. According to him, there were close to 8,000 young adults and 50,000 civilians in Narcissus Town. They belonged here and had the right to defend their rights, so he left these weapons for them to use in forming their own army. Yang Chendong believed that with weapons in Narcissus Town, no one would take the initiative to bully them as long as they were united against external threats. Of course, a person's path still had to be walked by themselves. Yang Chendong could not take care of them forever. Perhaps one day he would point his army at the new Urgan prefect, and the civilians would really be liberated. Yang Chendong did not know how long he would have to wait for that day. However, he was clear that his current mission was to get to the Walla region. If they were able to fight evenly with Baiming, he would not attack. Instead, he would head northeast to test the strength of the Mongolian cavalry. If possible, he would go north to the Golden Horde. That was also ruled by the Mongolians, and would be the Russian region in the future. As a country that spanned across the Eurasian continent, Russia had yet to rise. It had already lived under the rule of the Mongols for more than 200 years. In history, the Golden Horde was in a period of decline. Taking advantage of this opportunity to occupy this place and prevent the unborn Russia from ever appearing again was one of the main reasons he brought his army here. Of course, before doing this, he had to balance the military strength of northern Ming and Vala. Only when they were balanced and kept each other in check would he be able to free himself to deal with the Mongolian issue. Otherwise, he was afraid that he would have to make a move on the stronger side. After all, no matter if it was Walla or Baiming, Yang Qindong did not want either of them to become stronger. With a goal in mind, they followed the military plan and headed west to the Walla region after leaving Narcissus Town. Compared to before they entered Narcissus Town, the 5-star army was a lot stronger. When they walked on the main road, they looked a lot more majestic. It was obviously difficult for such an army to hide their tracks, so they were quickly targeted by the Baiming cavalry from Saha River City and Taining City. This time, Chiliarch Yella personally led 300 cavalry from the Saha River Guards. Along with him were 300 cavalrymen from Peaceful City, led by Vice Qianhu Lu Dai. A total of 600 cavalry followed behind the 5-star army. If they were slow, they would be slow. If they were fast, they would be fast too. It was obvious that they could not beat them, but they would definitely bite them to death. The news of the sudden appearance of Baiming cavalry was immediately sent to Yang Qindong, who was on his white dragon horse. Reconnaissance Battalion Commander Su Yinsheng, who was also riding on a horse, came to Yang Qindong's side. Thanks to the expansion of the army, he had filled up another battalion and returned to his position as battalion commander. 6th Young Master, we have already asked around. The ones following us are Baiming cavalry from the Saha River Guards and Taining City. They have a total of 600 cavalry. Oh right, the 2 Kiliarchies leading the troops are called Yella and Lu Dai. They are both Nuzan. I heard from the captives that they are very good at fighting, Su Yinsheng said excitedly. Although both Yi La and Lu Dai were very careful, if they wanted to follow the 5-star army, they would have to send out scouts to follow them. Just 2 hours ago, Su Yinsheng had used the 95 style to injure 2 enemy scouts on horseback. From their mouths, he had hurriedly rushed over to report the situation to them. 600 cavalry? Nuzan generals. Yang Qindong's lips twitched into a smile. Looks like news of what happened in Narcissus Town has already spread. They should already know that we were the ones who stole over 2,000 warhorses from Jian Province, Northern Guard, and Northern Guard. Su Yinsheng was originally feeling smug about getting some information about the enemy, but after hearing Yang Qindong's analysis, he was naturally confused. 6th Young Master, that shouldn't be. We did everything cleanly from the beginning to the end. Although many people in Narcissus Town know about this, we just left. The news shouldn't have spread so quickly, right? Haha, nothing is absolute. Who knows if there are other channels in Narcissus Town that can spread the news to the outside world? Yang Qindong shook his head. He would never underestimate any enemy, nor would he think that he was the smartest person. Because anyone who did this would not live long. There was nothing wrong with thinking the best of things, but preparing for the worst. Alright, increase the number of scouts at the front. If I'm not wrong, there should be people waiting for us at the Liao River area in front of us. His tone was neither hurried nor slow, but his attitude was very firm. Su Yinsheng was very puzzled when he saw all this. How did the 6th Young Master know that there would be enemies waiting for them ahead? He was the leader of the scouts, okay? However, since this was what the 6th Young Master said, Su Yinsheng naturally could not object. He only agreed with a dubious thought and rode off. Liao River was a large river that blocked the path of the 5-star army. There were only 2 ways to enter the Walla area from Narcissus Town. One was to go north over the mountains and cross the Daxing and mountain range, or go west and cross the Liao River. Considering that the army was now all cavalry, passing through a primitive forest like the Daxing and mountain range was extremely difficult. In the end, Yang Qindong made a decision and decided to take the Liao River. However, if they wanted to pass through the Liao River, they would definitely have to return to the territory under the Jian Province Guard's jurisdiction. It would not be easy for so many troops to take the path. It was very likely that a great battle would be unavoidable. Fortunately, Yang Qindong had already made preparations for this. He wanted to train his troops, and what was the best way to increase an army's combat strength? Of course it was a great battle to his heart's content. It could be said that when Yang Chendong chose to enter the Walla through the Liao River, he had already made preparations for a battle with the Baiming army. However, what he never expected was that because he wasn't able to return, the news was leaked ahead of time. Right now at the Liao River, it wasn't just the nearby Baiming's 30,000 guards that were waiting for him. The Jian Province Left Guard, Maolian Guard, Twin City Guard, Jian Province Guard, and Shenyang Central Guard that received the news had already sent troops, or they had already hurried to the northern source of the Liao River, or were currently hurrying over. The scouts sent out by the reconnaissance battalion quickly received this news. After compiling the information and sending it to Battalion Commander Su Yunxing's hands, it was then sent to Yang Chendong. At this moment, when Battalion Commander Su looked at Yang Chendong, his eyes were full of admiration and respect. Without any reference or data, completely relying on intuition and guesses to predict the next step of the situation. What was there to be scared of when following such a meticulous commander? Yang Chendong didn't reveal a trace of arrogance. Instead, he carefully read the information gathered by the reconnaissance battalion. The Twin City Guard had 300 infantrymen, the Maolian Guard had 300 infantrymen, and the Jian Province Left Guard had 2,000 infantrymen led by Commander Tang Longtian. In addition, the Jian Province Guard had 2,000 cavalrymen and 1,000 infantrymen led by Commander Sun Hong. The Shenyang Central Guard had 2,000 cavalrymen and 1,000 infantrymen led by Commander Zhu Dehai. In addition to the Liao River Guard and the Saka River Guard and Taining Guard that were following behind, there were around 5,000 cavalrymen and 5,000 infantrymen. This was a total of 10,000 enemies. For them to suddenly deploy such a force, it was clear that they wanted to seek justice for the 2,600 horses that were stolen from the Jian Province 3 guards. Could they really scare him with just these people? If it was before he went to Narcissus Town, he might have been a little afraid. But now Yang Chendong's strength had also grown. He had 12,000 men under him, and all of them were cavalrymen. They had the best war horses, the best weapons, and even the strongest combat power. Even with the addition of nearly 7,000 men, Yang Chendong could still confidently say that the mercenary army was still a first-class army. With the addition of powerful war horses, they could completely overcome the weakness of having a large number of new recruits. Chapter 658. On the other hand, although these northern Ming guards had been established for quite some time, they were limited by their environment and had not experienced any great battles. With their short-sightedness, it was easy for them to have an arrogant attitude of thinking that the heavens were number 1, the earth was number 2, and they were number 3. This was the time to teach them a good lesson. Calm and collected, full of vigor. After Yang Chendong digested the information and firmly memorized it in his heart, he raised his head again. At this moment, his face was still filled with confidence and his gaze was incomparably firm. Pass down the order, summon all the regiments and regimental commanders for a meeting. As they marched, Yang Chendong met with Wuxia and the other regimental commanders to confirm that they would not change their route. They had made the final decision to fight the Baiming guards head-on. What was worth mentioning was that Yang Chendong's troops were not without other options. For example, they could turn back now. Instead of going through the Liao River, they could go through the Dexing and mountain range. Although the path would not be easy to traverse, they could completely avoid the northern Ming guards. However, no one had expressed this intention since the beginning of the meeting. It was as if this choice did not exist. In the eyes of these regimental commanders, they only had one thought, and that was to kill, kill, and kill again. After deciding to fight the Baiming guards head-on, the next step was to mobilize the troops before the battle. In order to maximize the strength of the Jurchens and Mongolians who had just joined, Yang Chendong said that for every enemy they killed, every enemy's nose would be awarded 1 point and 10 taels of silver. In ancient times, there were many ways to record one's achievements. The most common way was to cut off the enemy's head to prove one's achievement. It was fine if one only killed 1 or 2 enemies, but if there were too many, one's entire body would be covered in heads. It would affect one's strength and it would still look too bloody. Yang Chendong suggested that the beheading should be changed to cutting off the nose, also known as cutting off the nose in ancient times. Once a person's nose was cut off, it was likely that not many people could continue to live. The so-called achievement was based on 100 points. Those who had more than 100 points were qualified to become an auxiliary soldier. Those who had more than 1,000 points were qualified to join the Cold Front. This was also Yang Chendong's tolerance towards the Jurchens and the Mongol cavalry. If it were any other alien race, no matter how great their contributions were, they would not be qualified to test Lung Feng. On the other hand, these two ethnic groups were heavily influenced by Han culture. If they were good material, he would not be stingy in polishing them. The rewards were passed down by the division commanders. When they found out that they could get 10 taels of silver for every enemy they killed, the Jurchens and Mongols, as well as the Han riders who had just joined the water ferry town, were all excited. The reason why they were willing to leave their hometown with the 5-star army was because they had a good impression of the army, but more importantly, they wanted to use this platform to show their worth. What was value? Earning more military merits and earning more taels of silver was the most direct manifestation of this. For a moment, they were all rubbing their fists. Whenever they had time, they would take out the whetstones they brought with them to sharpen the sabers in their hands even brighter and faster. The newcomers wanted to perform well and fight for the top prize. As veterans, Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers would not give in either. Over the past few days, although the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town looked at them with a hint of respect, it could be seen that the respect was due to envy and respect for the continuous fire guns in their hands. As for the combat power of the horses, it seemed like they were being looked down upon. This was something that the proud Lung Feng soldiers could not accept. What was the Lung Feng? It represented the strongest existence, the proudest existence. Once they appeared, they would become the focus of attention. How could they allow others to look down on them? This was a form of blasphemy to their identity. How could they make others respect them? Of course, they had to perform well on the battlefield. Therefore, after the mobilization before the battle, Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers had been training non-stop apart from sleeping and traveling. Getting on the horse, getting off the horse, slashing, increasing speed, dodging, and other movements were all trained tirelessly. Unknowingly, their strength improved bit by bit and became stronger. Compared to the hard work of Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers, and compared to the sharpening of the cavalry, the Baiming army's camp by the Liao River was very relaxed. Ever since they came to the new, Urgan-Dusi region, the Baiming guards had become the ruler here. Especially when the other factions were still very weak and had not been able to rise up, they were the sky here, the boss here. Since they were the boss, of course they had a sense of superiority. They only needed to point their weapons at a place, and that place would have to submit. This seemed to have become an iron law. As time passed, they got used to being high above others and used to bullying others. The more they were like this, the more dissatisfied they were with the 5-star army's actions. They did not have any ideas about the 5-star army, but instead they were targeted and tricked by someone else. How could they face this? If they did not get back at them, how could they face others in the future? The 5-star army had to pay the price. This was something they had all come to a consensus. As a result, the Jian Province Left Guard, Jian Province Guard, and Shenyang Central Guard all sent out their troops. 5,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry. In their eyes, this type of formation was enough to scare the 5-star army's legs until they went soft. Arrogant, and condescending, it made many of the northern Ming soldiers who came here treat this official mission as a vacation. Even though the scouts at the front were continuously sending back news, even though there were scouts at the front that had already been captured by the enemy, their side's formation should have already been known by the enemy. As the commanding generals of this battle, Jian Province Guard Commander Sun Hong, Shenyang Central Guard Commander Zhu Dehai, and Jian Province Left Guard Commander Tan Long Tian still had an appearance of victory in their grasp. Since you already know our strength, then you should feel even more fear, right? The three generals had this type of confidence. In reality, they also possessed great influence. This type of formation could scare many people without even fighting. For example, if this type of formation was placed in front of Borte and Bajen who had already been killed by 1,000 cuts, perhaps there really was no need to fight. They would have to consider surrendering or running away. This was precisely the powerful influence of the Baiming army. Meanwhile, this type of influence was established precisely during Emperor Zhu Di's reign. This emperor who relied on great strength to fight his way to power, developing the navy, conquering Mongolia in the north, conquering Jiaoji in the south, establishing great contributions. He also struck fear into the hearts of the other races around the Great Ming Dynasty. Once they heard that this was the Great Ming Dynasty's army, they would often collapse without a fight, defeat set in stone. Unfortunately, that was already in the past. The defeat of Tu Mu already indicated that the Great Ming Dynasty had fallen from its peak. If they did not change and did not work hard, after 100 years, they would completely walk out of the stage of history. These were all things that Yang Chendong knew. These Baiming guards were still unaware, still living under the powerful halo of their ancestors, still waiting for the 5-star army to dismount and surrender. The ignorant were fearless. It was precisely because they did not think that the 5-star army was that powerful that they were destined to pay the heaviest price in the upcoming battle. 3 days later, the 5-star army finally appeared 20 miles away from the Liao River, and quickly set up camp here. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and the fragrance of meat permeated the air. There was a lot of meat, wine, cigarettes, and other things that were prepared by Yang Chendong before he came to the new Organ du Sea. The meat was cured and could guarantee that the meat would not spoil for a certain period of time. When the fragrance of the meat began to spread, the entire camp instantly became lively. Lung Feng and the auxiliary soldiers were better off as their meals were not bad. They could not eat hot food unless they were marching or fighting and needed to be hidden. If it was during normal times, except for breakfast, there would be meat for almost every meal. They were used to it. On the other hand, the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town and the Windchaser cavalry were overjoyed. Most of them were young, and this was the time when they could eat. Since there was enough meat, everyone was naturally prepared to have a big meal to satisfy their appetite. Of course, when the fragrance of the meat permeated the air, everyone knew very well that the war was about to begin. However, no one was nervous. Whether it was the battle-hardened Lung Feng, the Windchaser cavalry, or the cavalrymen from Narcissus Town, they were all used to seeing life and death. To them, war was a process of death. The only difference was one's strength and luck. At the same time, war was also a process for them to reap rewards. Once they won, the benefits they received would be much greater than usual. As the saying went, wealth comes from danger. Needless to say, after witnessing the might of the continuous fire muskets in the hands of the Lung Vanguard and the shiny steel sabers in the hands of the Lung Vanguard, the auxiliary troops, and the Windchaser cavalry, although they were envious, they also wanted to own such powerful and excellent weapons one day. At the same time, they were very confident. With such powerful comrades, what was there to be afraid of? Victory would definitely belong to them. The 5-star army finally arrived and set up camp 20 miles away. When the news reached the Baiming army's camp, the 3 generals in charge gathered together. However, there was no prepared sand table in front of them, and the 3 of them did not intend to sit down and discuss tactics. There was only meat and wine in front of them. The 3 of them ate and drank as they talked about their experiences. Most of the time, they talked about the war between Baiming and Walla. Both sides suddenly fell out with each other. Then both sides stationed their troops at the border. After that, they began probing each other. Once they got used to each other's tactics or figured out each other's strength, a huge battle would be unavoidable. Chapter 659. As part of the Baiming army, the 3 generals weren't nobodies. Today they were talking about the war over there. Who knew when they would be transferred to the front lines? Therefore, the 3 of them were talking about the situation over there. They ignored the 5-star army that had arrived in front of them. Even though the scouts had reported that there were more than 10,000 people on the other side, and that they were all cavalry, the 3 generals still didn't take them seriously. Perhaps they already knew that the 5-star army was recruiting soldiers in Narcissus Town. From their point of view, How strong could a newly formed army that hadn't even gone through training yet be able to display such a strong combat strength? They were the Baiming army and represented the strongest country and army in the world. Why would they be afraid of a new army that hadn't undergone the baptism of the battlefield? However, they had quite a number of warhorses. After defeating the 5-star army, the 3 generals could sit down and discuss how to divide them up. The 3 generals drank and chatted until they were a little tipsy. Only then did they disperse. Only then did Sun Hong, the commander of the Jian Province Guards, speak. General Zhu, General Tang, I hope that we can unite tomorrow and restore our glory. Yes, please rest assured, General Sunday. Zhu Dahai and Tang Longtian also cupped their fists with a serious look on their faces. Then they strode out of the tent. At this moment, the 3 of them didn't take tomorrow's battle seriously. In their opinion, it was like an adult beating a child. They usually didn't want to lower themselves to your level, but once they stretched out their arms, victory would be decided with a slap. The mercenary camp was also unusually quiet at this moment. Other than the soldiers on night duty, everyone else had already gone to sleep after eating their fill. There would be a big battle tomorrow, so everyone needed to conserve their energy. In Yang Chendong's commander's tent, there were still oil lamps that hadn't been extinguished. With that qi, Yang Chendong would often rest for 4 hours a day to ensure that he would be full of energy and vigor. At this time, he was not sleepy yet. He was standing in front of the sand table and looking carefully. Even though he held another military meeting before dinner and discussed all the possible problems that should be prepared and might happen, he still wanted to verify if there was any negligence before the war. Perhaps some people would attribute all of Yang Chendong's achievements to Okura, but if it wasn't for his hard work and diligence, even if he could win, he wouldn't have made such great progress in less than 4 years. Young master, it's almost midnight. Go and rest. Tiger's Mane walked into the tent sleepily. He first patted Beta Persei, who was standing at the side waiting for orders, and told him to take the time to rest. Tiger's Mane then walked over to the sand table. You slept well. Yang Chendong raised his head and casually glanced at Tiger's Mane, who was walking over, then waved his hand. I'm not sleepy yet. I don't need anyone to serve me here. You can go and sleep a little longer. When Tiger's Mane came to Yang Chendong's side, he had already recovered his energetic appearance. No need, young master. I'll sleep after dinner. I've slept enough, hee. Then, after looking at the sand table, he asked curiously, Is there a problem? No. Yang Chendong straightened his body and lightly shook his head. Then, with a smile on his face, he said, I've made sufficient preparations. As long as nothing unexpected happens, the outcome of the battle will be decided. Accidents? It doesn't seem to rain tomorrow, right? Tiger's Mane said casually. After following Yang Chendong for so long, he already knew that weather changes could sometimes become an important factor to affect the battle. But when he walked out of his tent just now, he saw the sky full of stars. Presumably, it would be a sunny day tomorrow. Of course there won't be rain. Yang Chendong continued to smile, and a confident light appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not only will there be no rain, it should be a sunny day tomorrow. How about this? You go and inform the soldiers to wake up later tomorrow morning. Let them sleep for 2 more hours. No. 3 hours will do. Yes. Tiger's Mane was stunned at first. He didn't understand why he had to wake up so late. But since it was the 6th young master's order, he would of course do his best to carry it out. But in his heart, he thought, could it be because the troops didn't get a good rest during the march, so the soldiers were allowed to sleep a little longer? Actually, it wasn't just Tiger's Mane who thought this. The next morning, the other soldiers who woke up 3 hours later than usual all had the same thought. They slept for about 10 hours. Everyone was full of energy and didn't feel tired at all. The 6th young master felt sorry for them, but he didn't know that Yang Chendong had his reasons for doing this. The 10,000 soldiers of the Northern Bright Guards had indeed woken up very early in the morning. In fact, they were all woken up before the sky was completely bright. Although some of them didn't get enough sleep and were a little dissatisfied when they thought about how the 5-star army had already appeared in front of them. Even if they didn't take the initiative to attack, they would still fight back. In other words, There was bound to be a big battle today. Since that was the case, it didn't matter if they slept a little less. It wasn't just the soldiers. Even the commanding generals Sun Hong, Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian woke up an hour earlier than usual. Afterwards, they started a fire to cook, put on their armor, and brought out their war horses. They were all ready for battle. The sky gradually brightened, and the sun began to rise. Under the cloudless sky, it indicated that today would be a sunny day. Hee, the weather is good, but I don't know if the 5-star army's mood is good too. Sun Hong, who had already mounted his warhorse, looked at Zhu Dehai and Tang Longtian and laughed heartily. He had a relaxed expression on his face. The two generals naturally laughed along. At this moment, they seemed to have already seen a large number of war horses being captured by them, and the scene of them achieving great military merits. Reporting, the 5-star army has begun to move. A troop of nearly 2,000 cavalry has already left their camp and is slowly approaching us. They are currently about 18 miles away from us. A scout rode his horse to the front of the three generals and quickly jumped off his horse and knelt on the ground as he reported, "Are you going to make a move now?" Good scout again. Hearing that the 5-star army was indeed going to attack, Sun Hong didn't think much of it. Everything was within their expectations. The three generals had already reached a consensus. Since the 5-star army had arrived at the Liao River, if they wanted to cross, they would have to face them. At that time, they would only have two choices: attack or defend. However, if they only defended, they wouldn't be able to get supplies for a long time. Thus, attacking was the most likely option. Now that they heard that the other party had sent out close to 2,000 cavalry, they naturally wouldn't panic. On the contrary, they were somewhat dissatisfied with the fact that they only sent out 2,000 soldiers. With such a small number, it wasn't even enough to fill the gaps between their teeth. The scout obeyed the order and turned around to scout again. After the time it took for an incense stick to burn, another scout returned and reported that the 5-star army's cavalry was only 12 miles away from them. After such a long time, they only managed to run 8 miles. The 5-star army's cavalry is too slow. This time, without waiting for Sun Hong to express his opinion, Shenyang Central Guard Commander Zhu Dehai had already laughed out loud. This person was slightly chubby. When he laughed, his warhorse seemed to be greatly pressured as it paced back and forth a few steps. The armor on his body also trembled along with his laughter. It looked quite comical. Haha, not bad. The 5-star army's cavalry is too slow. It seems like there's nothing to worry about. Sun Hong laughed and nodded. At this moment he was even more confident in this battle. After hearing Commander Sun Hong and Commander Zhu Dehai's words, the other Qianhu and Baihu commanders beside them all nodded. The commander of the Jianzhou left guard, Tang Longtian, directly shouted, "Inform the soldiers to be alert and prepare to face the enemy." The Beiming City Guard soldiers who were originally standing by the river lazily were all alerted by their superiors. Some of them held large swords, some of them held shields, some of them held bows and arrows, some of them held spears, and some of them prepared barricades. They all began to move. They were only waiting for the 5-star army's cavalry to appear, so that they could teach them a lesson. 20 miles away, in the 5-star army's camp, the soldiers had a good night's sleep. After eating a nutritious breakfast, they began to wait for the order to march. In the command tent, after waiting for the regimental and battalion-level officers to walk in one by one, they stood in 2 rows and looked at Yang Chendong, who was sitting at the head of the table. After looking at each officer, Yang Chendong, who was originally serious, suddenly smiled and explained, "The plan has changed. The time of the attack has been extended to 2 hours, but I don't know if everyone is ready now?" Reporting to the 6th young master, "The preparations are complete. We can attack at any time." The officers were full of energy as they spoke. Good. Influenced by his words, Yang Chendong nodded his head in satisfaction. Then he looked at Su Yunsheng, the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, and asked, "How are the Bugs Northern Ming cavalry scouts being dealt with? Have the 1st and 2nd regiments set off according to the plan?" Su Yunsheng, who was called, stood up straight and raised his head. He was full of energy as he said, Reporting to the 6th Young Master, 32 Baiming were killed an hour ago. Commander Wu and Political Commissar Chen have already set off according to the plan. They should arrive at the designated location in 2 hours and launch the attack. Beautiful. Yang Chendong snapped his fingers and looked at Su Yinsheng. The reconnaissance battalion did a good job. After this mission is completed, you will be the first to receive the credit. Now I have another mission for you. You can take care of the 600 cavalry soldiers that are tailing us. Chapter 660. When Su Yinsheng heard that he could obtain a first merit, his face was already filled with excitement. Now that he heard that there was a battle to fight, he immediately stood at attention in excitement. 6th Young Master, please rest assured. I will definitely complete the mission. With regards to Su Yinsheng, Yang Chendong was still very reassured. Up until now, whenever a mission was given to him, there was not a single time where it was not completed well. Knowing that the Baiming cavalry behind him would not cause any trouble, his gaze once again fell on Jue Feng and Lu Zhua. Then he used an encouraging tone and said, "This time, the 3 divisions will only be cooperating in battle. Only your 2 reinforced regiments will be the main force. This is also the first time you guys are going to battle since the expansion. I hope that you guys will be able to produce a perfect result. This young master also has great confidence in you guys. Now, go and prepare for battle." After saying this, Yang Chendong intentionally raised his hand to look at his watch. The attack will begin at 10:30 in the morning. You guys have less than an hour to prepare. Yes. Jue Feng and Lu Zhua simultaneously gave a military salute. Then, they led their respective battalion commanders out of the command tent. Next, it was time to use actions to perform. No matter how beautiful the words were, it was better to do things well and fight the battle well. In the blink of an eye, the large tent became empty. Seeing that there was no one else around, Tiger, Ming could not help but come to Yang Chendong's side. "Young Master, you see that they all have a mission. The auxiliary barracks can't always be idle. The 6 battalion commanders have already reported to me. They also want to contribute and go to the battlefield." According to the original plan, the auxiliary barracks really had nothing to do with this battle. Their main mission was to take care of the logistics and the resources in their hands. When they first came to Sea Town from the sea, they brought a lot of resources. If anything happened to them, then the food and water of the army would become a problem. However, Yang Chendong could understand Tiger's man's feelings. After the expansion of the army, the 6 auxiliary battalions were placed under his direct control. Later on, he gave the authority to Tiger's man to train his abilities. This made Hu Mang so happy that he almost choked. As Yang Chendong's closest and most trusted person, he had a lot of power. Not only did the 2 guards have to listen to him, even the other division commanders had to be respectful when they saw him. But after all, he had never led an army before. This was his regret. Now it was all right. The young master had helped him make up for this regret. Now that he had 6 auxiliary barracks in his hands, if there was a big battle, he definitely wouldn't be able to participate, so there was no need to mention how anxious he was. Yang Chendong pondered for a moment. Since he wanted to train his tiger's mane, how could it be called training if he didn't go to the battlefield? Okay, then you can leave 2 of the 6 auxiliary battalions to watch over the resources. You can lead the other 4 battalions. But there is one condition. Let the 2 reinforced regiments charge first. You can only lead the charge 15 minutes after they charge out. Okay, I promise I won't lead the charge. Tiger's man seemed to be afraid that Yang Chendong would go back on his word, so he hurriedly stood at attention. Then he ran out of the command tent with a smile. Although the order to attack was the last, no matter what, it was still a chance to lead the troops. This was already a big breakthrough for him. Baiming Garrison Camp. The infantry and cavalry were separately preparing for defense. According to the plan, they would first block the first wave of attacks from the 5-star army. Then the cavalry would suddenly charge out and completely defeat the 5-star army. The development of reality was very smooth at first. There were already scouts who reported that the 5-star army was moving towards them. Although there were less than 2,000 cavalry, It was enough for them to prepare for battle. What they didn't expect was that when the previous scout reported that the enemy was less than 12 miles away, the next scout reported that the 5-star army suddenly stopped and then retreated. They retreated? Sun Hong's face was filled with disbelief. He then looked at Zhu Dahai and Tang Longtian beside him. Zhu Dahai, who was being stared at by him, also had a face full of confusion. He could only find an explanation for himself. Could it be that they found something wrong? But that shouldn't be the case. We didn't prepare any ambush. They really didn't prepare any ambush. Perhaps in the eyes of the 3 generals, even if they were to face the 5-star army head-on, they still had enough confidence to defeat them. Even if the enemy's numbers were not less than theirs, even if the enemy was all cavalry, they still thought so. It had to be said that they were that confident. Oh no. It should be said that they were that arrogant. It was precisely because they didn't prepare any ambush that the 5-star army's sudden stop and subsequent retreat was so confusing. Just as the 3 generals were looking at each other, another cavalry scout reported that the 5-star army had started moving again. But it was obvious that they were moving at a very slow speed. What are they doing? Sun Hong was confused. This kind of advance, stop, retreat, and advance again. Moreover, the speed of the advance was very slow. It was really out of his expectations. It had to be said that he had led troops for many years, but not to mention seeing this kind of fighting method. It was the first time he had even heard of it. General Sun, do you think they are afraid? That's why they, Tang Longtian, the commander of the Jianzhou left guards, seemed to have suddenly thought of something and asked. After hearing Tang Longtian's explanation, Zhu Dahai, who was also at a loss, silently nodded his head. It seemed like this was a reasonable explanation. Otherwise, why would the enemy move forward and retreat in a completely different way from the norm on the battlefield? Ha 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 ha. Sun Hong also believed that this was the result, and immediately laughed out loud. Not bad, not bad. It seems like the enemy is really afraid. However, I believe that the general of the 5-star army is still very arrogant and wants to fight with us. Unfortunately, his soldiers are much smarter than him, so they are moving forward and retreating at the same time. Yes, it must be like this. If this is the case, victory is already on our side. Sun Hong was so happy and excited that Tang Longtian naturally laughed along with him. At the same time, he suggested an idea. General Sun, why don't we take the opportunity to kill our way out and seize victory while the enemy is hesitating? Sai, no rush, no rush. Let them be anxious and afraid for a while. After a while, the time will be more ripe. At that time, we will be able to achieve victory in one go. Haha. Sun Hong laughed towards the sky, full of confidence. His laughter caused the surrounding generals to laugh as well. It was obvious that everyone's thoughts were the same as Sun Hong's. Amidst the laughter, the 3rd Regiment of the 3rd Cold Front Division was slowly advancing 10 miles ahead. Under the leadership of their regiment commander Chun Yang, their marching speed was extremely slow. It was already slower than walking by 5 minutes. The 1st Battalion commander Lu Qing rode beside Chun Yang, who was wearing a black cloak, with an envious expression on his face. The cloak was indeed very cool. Wearing it would unknowingly make one look very cool. Unfortunately, the requirement was that only the regiment commander and above could wear a cloak. Lu Qing was only a battalion commander, and had just been promoted from a company commander after the expansion. At this moment he could only look at Chun Yang with envy. His gaze moved from the black cloak to Chun Yang. Lu Qing took the initiative to speak. Regiment commander, can we only lure the enemy this time? The division commander and the political commissar can lead the 1st and 2nd regiments into battle, right? Our mission. Lu Qing stopped halfway through his sentence. However, Chun Yang knew what he wanted to say. He turned his head to look at him, and spoke in an extremely calm tone. We are in charge of luring the enemy. This is the military order of the 6th young master. Are you doubting the 6th young master? His voice wasn't very loud. In fact, only the 2 of them could hear him clearly. However, this sentence was enough to make Lu Qing's face turn pale. Cold sweat flowed down his body. No. I wouldn't dare. How could I doubt the 6th young master? Chen Yang knew that Lu Qing didn't have the guts to do so. Not only Lu Qing, but also no one in the army would dare to think that way. Otherwise, the sixth young master wouldn't even need to make a move. Alright, completing the mission is what we need to do. As for killing the enemy, the higher-ups will naturally arrange it. Besides, the order is very clear. We can enter the battlefield, but we can't do it so quickly. We need to see the performance of the 1st and 2nd regiments first. We can only attack 15 minutes after they start attacking. So save up your strength and perform well when the time comes. Yes, Regiment Commander. When the time comes, you will see the performance of the 1st Battalion. Lu Qing couldn't help but clench his fists. As a new battalion commander, he indeed needed to perform well in order to submit a perfect answer sheet. The conversation between the two came to an end. The two of them didn't have any doubts about the order they received. For example, why did they have to retreat after advancing for a while? For example, why did they have to slow down? Since it was an order given by the 6th young master, it must be correct and the most reasonable. In fact, it wasn't only Regiment Commander Chunyang who didn't think about this question. Even the other regimental commanders didn't think about this question. If they thought about it, they would think that the 6th young master delayed the attack in order to completely outflank the enemy. At this moment it was already noon. The sun was moving towards the highest point in the sky and began to roast the earth. 5-Star Army's main camp. When the clock pointed to 10:30, the regiment commander of the 1st Regiment, Zhuai Feng, and the 2nd Regiment commander, Lu Zhua, looked at each other and raised the sabers in their hands. Then 2 black cloaks rushed out. They each led 2,000 cavalrymen and rushed out of the camp. They directly charged towards the Baiming army 20 miles away. Chapter 661. While the 2 reinforced regiments were moving out, there were 2 groups of cavalry slowly approaching from the north and south of the Liao River. The ones leading them were the 3 RD Division's commander Wu Sheng and the division's political commissar Chen Bo. As division commanders, the color of their cloaks had already turned pure white, making them look much more handsome and valiant when they wore them. They had also become the symbol of the army. The 2 men walking at the front of the 2 groups looked at the time on their wristwatches as they walked. Thanks to the reconnaissance unit, they had excellent weapons that could kill enemies from hundreds of feet away. This allowed them to kill Baiming scouts early on. Even when the 2 cavalry regiments arrived at the Liao River from the north and south, sealing off Baiming's left and right paths of retreat, the enemy still didn't notice. At this point, the first step of the mission was completed. The next step was to wait. When the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments suddenly appeared, they would seize the opportunity to attack Baiming's army from the flanks. They would break through their defenses and cause chaos in their ranks. This would help the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments gain control of the battle and obtain the final victory. In short, this time, they would play the supporting role and help the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments complete the final attack. From this order alone, it could be seen that Yang Chendong had put a lot of thought into the 1st and 2nd reinforced regiments. In order to increase their combat strength, he actually made the entire 3rd Division play the role of supporting troops. The time for the final attack was getting closer and closer. Wu Sheng led the 1st Regiment to the north, while Chen Bo led the 2nd Regiment to the south. They had completely surrounded the Baiming army. Right at this moment, the ground began to tremble. The experienced cavalry knew that this was caused by a large group of cavalry approaching. At the front of the battlefield, Zhuai Feng and Lu Zhua each led a reinforced regiment and rushed over. During this time, they overtook the 3 RD Division's 3rd Regiment that was in charge of attracting the enemy's attention. Then, without stopping, they rushed towards Baiming's main camp. In the center of Baiming's army, Sun Hong and the other generals also felt the ground tremble. The scouts in charge of gathering information also returned and reported that there were at least 4,000 to 5,000 5-star army cavalry rapidly approaching them. A great battle was on the verge of breaking out. It was inevitable. Sun Honggan sat on the horse without any panic. All of this was part of his plan. After all, in a battle between 2 armies, there would always be one side that would charge first. General Zhu, when the battle starts, please lead 2,000 infantrymen to attack the enemy from the left. This general will lead 2,000 cavalrymen to attack the enemy from the right. I'll have to trouble General Tang to take charge of the middle corps. Are you all okay with that? Sun Hong glanced left and right before his gaze landed on Generals Zhu Dahai and Tang Longtian. Even though Sun Hong's position was the highest among them, the commander of the Jian Province Guards, a major third-rank existence, while the other two were minor third-rank and major fourth-rank military officials, both of them far inferior to him. But after all, they were not from the same institution. They could choose to listen to his arrangements, or they could choose to act on their own. This was the reason why he was so polite. Understood. Fortunately, before the great battle, the three of them had already sat down together to discuss tactics and tactics. They agreed that Sun Hong would be the leader, so now, there naturally wouldn't be any problems. They cupped their fists and agreed. Very good. Then have the infantrymen make preparations to intercept the war horses. We have to stop them no matter what. Let these cavalrymen know just how insignificant their strength is when facing our Baiming's army, just how small their strength is, and just how small their strength is. Meanwhile, with only one person blocking their first wave of attacks, the other side are all new recruits, so their morale will definitely take a hit. They won't be far from becoming a defeated army. Sun Hong's face was full of high spirits. This time, they couldn't head to the front lines to fight Walla to the death, so they would just display their skills by the Liao River. After Sun Hong's voice fell, General Tang Longtian, who was in charge of commanding the infantrymen, immediately pulled out his sword and pointed it to the sky. He shouted loudly, "So infantrymen, listen to my orders and prepare for battle." A deafening sound began to ring out continuously. 1,000 shield-wielding soldiers with iron shields gathered in the center of the battlefield. From afar, they looked like a black flood of steel, forming an iron wall, blocking the path of the 5-star Army's cavalrymen. In front of this black iron wall, there were 1,000 Baiming soldiers setting up stakes and other objects. Behind the black iron wall, 1,000 archers also stood in rows, holding strong bows in their hands and carrying quivers of arrows on their backs. They looked like they were ready to draw their bows and shoot at any time to attack the 5-star Army's cavalrymen. On both sides of the black iron wall, there were northern Ming soldiers armed with large sabers and long spears. Their mission was to charge forward like a dog that had seen a bone once an enemy fell off their horse, and cut them into pieces in the shortest time possible. This was the formation used by Baiming infantrymen against cavalrymen. It was imitating the formation of the Southern Dynasty's founding emperor Liu Yu. In the past, when facing the powerful Northern Wei cavalrymen, Liu Yu had 700 soldiers go ashore, and the Yanhe River tribe set up hundreds of chariots to defend against the cavalrymen's charge. The two ends of the chariot formation were curved like a crescent moon. This was the formation that people loved to talk about. Because they didn't have chariots, the Baiming soldiers used stakes and shields to replace them. Although the effect might not be as good, as long as they could block the first charge of the 5-star Army cavalry, they would be in a stalemate. The cavalry led by General Sun Hong and General Zhu Dahai would then surround them from both sides. In the end, they would ambush the enemy cavalry from all sides and kill them. It could be said that the Baiming soldiers had made sufficient preparations this time. They looked like they wanted to hold back the 5-star Army. If the cavalrymen weren't prepared, once they entered the formation, it would be very difficult for them to escape. However, the problem was that the 5-star Army's cavalrymen weren't prepared. The Baiming Army's formation had already been set up. Sun Hong and Zhu Dahai each led 2,000 cavalrymen to surround the enemy from both sides. The vanguard of the 5-star Army's cavalrymen could be seen with the naked eye. They were constantly approaching the center of the battlefield, and were getting closer and closer to the Baiming Army's archers. Kill! Kill with me! Zhui Feng took the lead. Just like his name, he became the vanguard of the charge. Even the 2nd Regiment's commander, Lu Zhua, was at least 200 meters away from him. Archers, get ready! Tang Longtian, who was in the middle of the formation, saw the enemy cavalrymen getting closer and closer. When they were about to enter the archer's shooting range, he raised his right arm and looked like he was ready to fire at any moment. The 1,000 northern Ming archers also quickly drew their bows and aimed at the front. Once the order was given, they would release the arrows in their hands and kill the enemy. The atmosphere on the battlefield had become extremely tense. As the five-star army's cavalrymen got closer and closer, the atmosphere became even more tense. It was like a taut bowstring that could break at any moment. This is the time. Blow the bugle call. Wu Sheng, who had already moved to the north and south sides of the Baiming army, used his binoculars to see all the movements on the battlefield. When he saw that the battle was about to begin, he gave the order to charge to the 5 officers who had been waiting for a long time. Beep 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 beep. The loud bugle call suddenly sounded and broke the silence between heaven and earth. Then the bugle call sounded and 3,000 cavalrymen suddenly charged into the battlefield from the north and south. They came to the sides and the back of the Baiming army. The sudden change caused Tang Longtian, who was in the middle of the formation, to turn around and look. When he saw that there were actually countless enemy cavalry appearing, he first said not good, and then ordered his deputy beside him, Wang Tong of the 30,000 guards, to lead the remaining 300 cavalry to charge out and stop the cavalry of the 5-star corps that suddenly appeared behind them. General Sun Hong, who was riding on a horse to surround the 5-star army's cavalrymen, was also shocked by the huge formation behind him. He had a feeling of uneasiness just now. He kept thinking that something was wrong, but he couldn't figure it out. Now he finally understood. It turned out that he didn't receive any information from the scouts on both sides. He didn't even see them. It turned out that they were killed by the 5-star army. How did they do it? Those who could become scouts were smart and agile. It was understandable that 1 or 2 of them were killed. He sent out a total of 32 scouts on both sides. Why didn't any of them come back to report? A big question mark appeared in his heart. However, it wasn't the time to think about these things. What he needed to do now was to win in the chaos. Since there were already enemy cavalrymen behind him, even if he went back now, he wouldn't be able to avoid losses. He might as well go according to his original plan and kill them. As long as he could heavily injure or eliminate the 5-star army's cavalrymen, he would be able to retreat and deal with the enemy behind him. Originally, he wanted to wait for the enemy to enter the infantry formation. He wanted to wait until both sides were in a stalemate before making his move. But now, it seemed that he couldn't wait anymore. Since that was the case, he could only attack first. Sun Hong quickly made a decision. The 2,000 cavalrymen who were originally moving slowly started to move under his command. They suddenly accelerated and charged towards the 5-star army's cavalrymen. But just as they rushed forward, an even bigger problem appeared. Strong rays of sunlight shone into their eyes, causing them to close their eyes involuntarily. They couldn't even see what was happening in front of them. How could they fight this battle? Sun Hong was also unable to see the situation in front of him, because of the strong sunlight. He couldn't help but think in his heart. Could it be that even the heavens want to take care of the 5-star army? How could he have known that Yang Qindong intentionally launched his attack 4 hours later? The effect was finally revealed. It was noon, so the side facing the sunlight would naturally suffer a great loss. This was also the reason why the cavalrymen of the 3 divisions would sometimes advance and sometimes retreat. They wanted to drag out the time until the sun was high up in the sky. When the sunlight was absolutely effective, they would launch their attack. In a situation where even the weather was taken into consideration, Sun Hong's charge naturally caused a huge problem. It was equivalent to announcing the outcome of the battle, and even the death penalty for some people. Chapter 662. The sun is too bright, I can't see anything. Not good, I can only ride with my head down. I can't see the situation in front of me. The cavalry below had only just sped up when all sorts of questions were sent back. As the main general, Sun Hong had a bad feeling in his heart. He knew that it was time for him to make a decision. If he hesitated for even a moment longer, he would suffer irreparable losses. Retreat. Everyone retreat and regroup with the infantry. He knew that if they continued to charge forward, they wouldn't even be able to use 1/5 of their strength. How would they fight this battle? He immediately gave the order while turning his horse around. On the other side, Zhu Dahai also made the same decision as Sun Hong. He also led his troops towards the sun, and similarly felt the blinding sunlight. He also knew that if they continued to fight, they would not be able to display their strength. Thus, he decisively gave the order to retreat. Just like this, before they could complete the encirclement, before the battle even started, the 4,000 Baiming cavalry had no choice but to retreat. However, it was already too late for them to retreat. Behind them, the 3,000 cavalry from the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 3rd Division had already broken through the 300 cavalry led by Wang Tong. In front of 10 times the cavalry, Wang Tong had acted in a panic. After a single charge, Wang Tong was cut down on his horse by Wu Sheng, who was wielding a steel saber. With the death of their main general, the rest of the cavalry lost their morale. They put up a show of resistance and threw down more than 100 corpses before returning to the middle of the infantry. Behind these 100 over Northern Ming Dynasty cavalrymen, there were over 3,000 cavalrymen from the 5-star army. They urged their horses to chase after the Northern Ming Dynasty cavalrymen, while shouting loudly. From time to time, they would shoot arrows with the bows in their hands. Without any morale, the 100 or so Baiming cavalry didn't even have the strength to fight back. After throwing down more than half of the corpses, less than 80 of them made it back to the middle of the army. Before they could even gain a foothold, Wu Sheng and Chen Bo had already led the 1st and 2nd regiments to kill their way behind them. Every time they raised their sabers, they would reap the life of an enemy soldier. At the front, Windchaser had already led a company of cavalry as the vanguard to kill Baiming's infantry. With their superb horsemanship, they leaped over the barricades on the ground and launched a series of fierce attacks on the shield-bearers. Due to the chaos at the rear, the 1,000 shield-wielding soldiers were already in disarray. The enemies at the front were also charging ferociously. Very quickly, some of the weaker Baiming infantry broke away from the formation. Every time this happened, they would be faced with the fall of a sharp saber, or the result of a person's head flying off with a raise of a saber. Following Zhui Feng's arrival, 1st Battalion Commander Ding Yu, 2nd Battalion Commander Gao Danhua, and 3rd Battalion Acting Battalion Commander, Hulu's subordinates all followed behind. With the advantage in numbers and the speed of the steeds, the infantry shield-bearers, who were already riddled with holes, suffered heavy pressure again and again. Finally, their formation was thrown into chaos, and they were all separated and killed by the cavalry. Regiment Commander Lu Zhua of the 2nd Reinforced Regiment also rushed over. Seeing that the enemy's infantry were already in disarray, and that it was only a matter of time before they were defeated, he turned his spear and aimed it at Zhu Dehai's 2,000 cavalry that were still retreating. Battalion Commander Ma in the middle, Battalion Commander Ding in the left, Battalion Commander Tay in the right. Everyone, follow me and kill. Lu Zhua had been promoted from the Auxiliary Regiment Commander to the Cavalry Regiment Commander. He wanted to perform well, but at this moment, Zhu Dehai's troops had become his stepping stone. In addition, the 3 battalion commanders under him were also outstanding cavalry. For example, 1st Battalion Commander Ma Xiangshan, 2nd Battalion Commander Ding Shan, and 3rd Battalion Acting Battalion Commander Tai Mu, were all people who had interacted with war horses for many years. He was very confident in their strength. Now that he had the opportunity, he naturally wanted to use his cavalry to attack his cavalry. He wanted to see the strength of his cavalry regiment. Cavalry against infantry, and with the advantage in numbers, even if he won, there was nothing to brag about. However, when cavalry fought against cavalry, it would be a battle of swords and spears. It would depend on one's ability. The originally proud Ma Xiangshan and the others wanted to perform well. With Lu Zhua's order, it could be said that it was exactly what they wanted. Immediately, the 2,000 cavalry of the reinforced regiment quickly changed direction and went straight for Baiming Zhu Dehai's troops who were still retreating. Zhu Dehai, who was retreating, let out a sigh of relief. They didn't have to face the sun anymore. This allowed his cavalry to display their original strength. As the main commander, he had more confidence in his heart. However, before he could fully recover from his shock, a large number of cavalrymen appeared in front of them. This cavalry unit was wearing all kinds of clothing. From afar, there were Nuzan's clothing, Mongols' clothing, Han people's clothing, and even army green clothing. It could be said that there were all kinds of clothing. However, they all had one thing in common, and that was that each of them held a shiny saber in their hands, and each of them wore a pair of ink-black goggles that protected their eyes from afar. Naturally, the Northern Ming cavalry would be at a disadvantage if they were to face the sun head-on. However, with the addition of the sunglasses, the 2nd Regiment was no longer a problem. The glare of the sun had been reduced infinitely and was placed at the side. Right now, what they needed to do was to charge and charge. In the process of charging, the cavalry drew their bows and shot. As they approached, they shot the Baiming cavalry who were not fully prepared. Zhu Dahai's troops, who were retreating, had already lost their formation. Not to say that their formation was in chaos, but it was not too far off. Perhaps if they were given a certain amount of time, they could reorganize their troops. But would Lu Zhui give them time? One side was unprepared, and the other side was ready. One side was retreating in panic, and the other side was advancing bravely. Although the number of cavalry on both sides was the same, there were 2,000 cavalry. But the difference between being prepared and not being prepared was very big. So much so that before the cavalry of both sides officially came into contact, arrows rained down like raindrops. No less than 100 people in the vanguard of the Baiming cavalry were shot and fell from their horses. And this was just the beginning of the contest. When Ma Xiongfeng led the 1st Battalion to charge into the Baiming cavalry unit, and when Ding Shan's 2nd Battalion and Temu Er's 3rd Battalion stabbed into the Baiming army's formation like two sharp knives, Zhu Dahai's face finally showed a look of fear. At this moment, he realized that the cavalry under his command had become a pot of porridge. They didn't know where to charge and what to do. The steel cavalry sabers and ordinary cavalry sabers began the first round of clashes, followed by the 2nd round, 3rd round, and 4th round. After 4 rounds, the panicked and unprepared Baiming cavalry suffered great losses. About 1/7 of the cavalry was cut off from their horses. But what was even worse was that after 4 rounds of clashes, some of the cavalry sabers in the hands of the Baiming cavalry actually showed signs of breaking. The slightly better ones also had large gaps. If you want to attack first, you must first sharpen your weapon. Originally, they were not prepared enough. Now that the enemy had taken the initiative, they were caught unprepared. Then their weapons were not as sharp and durable as the enemy's. Some of the Baiming cavalry, although still seated on their horses, had nothing in their hands that could be used. Some were broken sabers, and some were even bare-handed. How were they going to fight the following battle? Retreat. Shocked by the strength of the 5-star army, shocked by the sharpness of the enemy's cavalry sabers, Zhu Dahai, who was protected by a dozen bodyguards, saw that his strength was not as good as the enemy's. He turned his horse around and madly galloped back. At this time, Zhu Dahai was very familiar with Sun Tzu's art of war. The last of the 36 stratagems was to run. If you can't win, run. This was the best example. At this time, Zhu Dahai was completely dizzy. He had already forgotten that once he turned around, he would be facing the glaring sunlight. But at this time, he had completely forgotten all of this. There was only one voice in his mind, and that was to run. As long as he could escape, he might have a chance to live. The situation was not good, so he turned around and ran without hesitation. Zhu Dahai still had a very decisive heart. But his luck was really too bad. After running against the sunlight for a few li, a large army suddenly appeared in front of him. Because of the light, he only saw the enemy swarming towards him when he was less than 2 li away. The dust that covered the sky and covered the sun was flying. It was the cavalry led by the 3 RD Division's 3rd Regiment, the Spring Sun Division, and the Independent Regiment Tiger's Mane. There were close to 3,000 people. According to Yang Chendong's orders, they had set off 15 minutes later. As if they were afraid that the enemy would be wiped out, from the beginning of the charge, the 2 cavalry forces were racing against each other, afraid that they would be one step slower than the enemy. Originally, after 15 minutes, the 2 reinforced regiments, the 1st and 2nd Divisions of the 3rd Division, Baiming's army would have been defeated. If they were lucky, they might be able to clean up the mess. But never would they have thought that before they even reached the battlefield, they would already see the enemy. Although there weren't many of them, only a few hundred cavalry, in the eyes of the spring sun and Tiger's mane, they were already a piece of juicy meat. Independent regiment, charge with me. Tiger's mane laughed heartily. He kept urging his warhorse to charge towards Zhu Dahai's troops. Regiment commander, what do we do? The 1st Battalion's commander Lu Qing urged his horse to Spring Sun's side. His face was filled with anxiety. What do we do? Of course we have to go. There is no such thing as superior and inferior on the battlefield, hee. Spring Sun laughed wildly. By the time he finished speaking, he had already charged out on his warhorse. Tiger's mane was his superior. Even his division commander, Wu Sheng, respected him. But this was the battlefield. There was no such thing as modesty when killing the enemy. Seeing the regiment commander dashing out without any hesitation, Battalion Commander Lu Qing laughed out loud and followed after him. The soldiers of the 3rd Regiment also yelled and shouted as they charged forward with their sabers in hand. Chapter 663. Poor Zhu Dahai. He thought that his actions were decisive. He thought that he was like a gecko with a broken tail, and that he could finally escape. But he never imagined that he would have to face 2 ferocious armies. When he discovered his opponents, his fate was already sealed. The cavalry from both sides collided in the blink of an eye. Just as the cavalry clashed with the cavalry, blood splattered everywhere. Sharp sabers flashing with silver light were constantly raised and chopped down. One by one, the Baiming cavalry was forced to block the attacks. Some of them couldn't even withstand one blow, and were immediately chopped down from their horses. Some of them were quite good on horseback, but when faced with continuous chopping, how many times could they block? They could only raise their arms a few more times. In the end, they still couldn't avoid the fate of being chopped down from their horses. Zhu Dahai's horse riding skills were considered passable. He was barely able to exchange blows with the 2 5-star army cavalrymen. Under the powerful impact, he could already feel his arms swelling. Just as he was thinking that he wouldn't be able to withstand a few more collisions like this, he was afraid that he wouldn't be able to lift his arm anymore. However, when their weapons collided for the 3rd time, a completely unexpected scene occurred. The saber in his hand actually broke into 2 pieces. How could this be? This scene caused Zhu Dahai's eyes to widen. The quality of the saber in his hand wasn't bad. How could it break after only 3 collisions? If he didn't even have a weapon, how could he fight? All kinds of thoughts flashed through his mind. Then, another cavalry from the 5-star army flew past them. Zhu Dahai reflexively raised his right arm to block the attack. But then, an intense pain spread from his arm to his entire body. Then he stared in disbelief as his right arm was separated from his body. Fresh blood spurted out from his body and filled his eyes. His right arm was already gone. He didn't feel the pain because the saber in the hands of the 5-star army was too fast. It was so fast that he didn't even feel the pain before everything was over. And before he could cry out in shock, another cavalry from the 5-star army rode past him. This was a scene that he would never forget for the rest of his life. For the first time he could clearly see his own back. That was the last thing he saw before his head flew high into the air. Then, there was only darkness, an endless and boundless darkness. The hundreds of Baiming cavalry that escaped were quickly disintegrated under 2 charges from the 5-star army. About 2/3 of them died in battle, and 1/3 was taken captive. At the same time, the Baiming cavalry under General Sun Hong was also targeted by the reinforced cavalry regiment. When Windchaser discovered that Lu Zhu's troops were chasing after Zhu Dahai's troops, he gave the task of dealing with the Baiming infantry to the 1st and 2nd regiments of the 3rd Division. He led the reinforced cavalry regiment to target the more powerful Sun Hong's troops. Using young Master Yang Chendong's words, 10,000 cavalry against 5,000 Baiming cavalry and 5,000 Baiming infantry. The battle hadn't even started yet, but the outcome had already been decided. Rather than calling it a battle, it was more accurate to call it a training exercise. Even if it was a training exercise, how to ignite everyone's fighting spirit, how to create an invincible heart through this battle. This was the true meaning of this battle. Since it was a training exercise, of course they had to choose the strongest enemy as their opponent. Looking at the battle horses, Baiming's 2,000 cavalry was barely enough to be seen. Everyone in the reinforced cavalry regiment, put on your glasses and follow this regiment commander. After adjusting the direction of the battle horses, Windchaser released a loud shout, taking the lead and bringing the 1st and 2nd regiments of the reinforced cavalry regiment to charge towards the right side of the battlefield. People shouted, horses neighed, banners covering the skies, bright 5-starred banners fluttering in the wind, everywhere. The bugle call that replaced the sounds of drums sounded again and again, loud and clear, pouring into the ears of everyone on the battlefield. Sun Hong, who was still backing up, had a downcast expression on his face. He ignored the direction of the sunlight, placing him in a completely passive state from the very start of the battle. He knew that he was going to suffer greatly today. However, he still didn't believe that he would lose, just that his losses would be a bit more serious. It was because he was leading 2,000 cavalry from the Jianzhou Guard, the elites of the northern soldiers, possessing second-rate fighting strength. Unless they were facing the Mongol cavalry and Walla cavalry who had lived on horses since childhood, no enemy would make him feel fear. Release the arrows, draw the blades, charge. Cut the enemy into several pieces. Let them know what kind of fate awaits those who make our Jianzhou Guard cavalry their enemies. A roar sounded. Sun Hong held a large blade that was over a zhang in length. After releasing a loud shout, under the protection of a group of personal guards, he increased the speed of his horse, charging towards the reinforced cavalry regiment led by Windchaser. The 1st battalion is at the front, the 2nd battalion is in the middle, and the 3rd battalion is at the back. Windchaser similarly didn't show any weakness. Brandishing the cavalry blade that flickered with cold radiance, after releasing a loud shout, he also took the lead and launched a fierce charge. The two forces of cavalry with similar strength and numbers finally began to clash an hour after the battle began. When enemies met on a narrow path, the courageous would emerge victorious. A battle of cavalry where every blade drew blood began. Charge, charge. The commanders of both sides separately gave the final military orders. A total of 4,000 warhorses clashed together by the Liao River, becoming a great battle. In just the first clash, there were already countless streaks of bright red blood that splashed in all directions. At any moment, there would be cavalry soldiers that fell off their horses, or there would be broken limbs that flew into the air. There were Baiming cavalry, Nuzhen cavalry, Mongol cavalry, and Han cavalry that fell off their horses. At this moment, the cavalry all displayed their abilities. At this moment, no one would show you the slightest bit of leniency because of your background or race. At this moment, if you didn't kill others, then you would be killed by others. No one was an exception. Windchaser raised his cavalry blade, already continuously hacking down more than 10 people. At least 4 Baiming cavalry were chopped off their horses by him. At the same time, 3 enemies were injured by him. His body also suffered 2 cuts. Fortunately, he had the protection of the bulletproof vest, so these 2 cuts didn't truly injure him. Jianzhou Guard cavalry is unordinary after all. After another charge, Windchaser, who had rushed to the back of Baiming cavalry, reined in his horse. He sighed in his heart, and at the same time, his fighting spirit was infinitely aroused. You guys are very strong, right? That's good. The stronger the opponent, the more you can train yourself. He believed that after this battle, although there would be some losses in the reinforcement regiment, their combat strength would definitely increase by a lot. Wasn't this what the 6th young master and himself wanted? Not far away, Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo, who had already divided the Baiming infantry into several groups, also noticed the battle on the right side of the battlefield. They saw that the reinforcement regiment already had more than 100 people killed or injured, but they didn't have any intention of joining in. If an army wanted to grow, the process must be bloody. Only after experiencing this could they become a truly strong army. During this process, others couldn't help much. Of course, Wu Sheng and Uncle Chen were also watching this place. As long as they noticed that the reinforcement regiment was not as strong as the enemy, they would immediately intervene. In short, they would never allow their side to be defeated in front of them. However, the reality was that this kind of thought was destined not to appear. After this clash, the two sides had already swapped positions. Hundreds of cavalry from both sides had fallen, as well as many lonely war horses. However, this didn't mean that the battle was over. It was just the beginning. After the two sides swapped positions, the dazzling sunlight once again shone on the faces of the Baiming cavalry. Sun Hong's expression was frighteningly dark. Just now he had also displayed his might and killed at least 3 5-star army cavalry. At the same time, he also noticed that the enemy had something that could protect their eyes. He didn't know what it was called, but he knew that with that thing, they didn't seem to be afraid of the dazzling sunlight. The enemy had it, but he didn't. Now that he had to face the sunlight and attack, the disadvantage would uncontrollably appear. The cavalry of the Jianzhou Guard seemed to be in danger. While Sun Hong was hesitating, the cavalry of the 5-star army cavalry on the opposite side once again charged over. It was still the 1st Battalion at the front, followed by the 2nd Battalion and the 3rd Battalion at the back. Ma Xiangshan, the commander of the 1st Battalion, shouted loudly. Combined with the blood of the enemy that flew to his face when he killed the enemy just now, it made him look very scary at this moment. There was a feeling of a killing god that walked out of hell. Ma Xiangshan held the saber in his right hand, and the reins in his left hand. He attached his body to the horse as much as possible to protect the streamline of his body and reduce the wind resistance. This allowed him to charge forward at a faster speed. This speed could multiply the power in his hands. At this time, once the saber was slashed out, even a small tree stump could be easily cut down. This was the power of the combination of speed and sharpness of the saber. The saber that was given to them this time, although it wasn't as long as the spear and saber, because it was short, it was more powerful and nimble. In addition, it had a very satisfying sharpness. The number of enemy cavalry that died in Ma Xiangshan's hands had already exceeded 5 people, which made him very satisfied. He also seemed to be born for the battlefield. After killing several people, not only did he not feel the slightest bit of fatigue, but he was also very excited. This excitement naturally turned into boundless killing intent. When he waved the saber again, his face was only left with a flush of excitement. The more he fought, the braver he became. This was the description of soldiers like Ma Xiangshan. Following Ma Xiangshan's loud shout, the soldiers of the 1st Battalion were also inspired and infected. They all shouted and rushed forward together with the battalion commander. From afar, he was like a sharp arrow that directly pierced into the ranks of the Baiming cavalry. Chapter 664. What was even worse was that behind this arrow, the 2nd Battalion's Ding Shan's troops and the 3rd Battalion's Taimu Er's troops also formed arrows and flew straight over with an unstoppable momentum. In comparison, the Northern Ming cavalry was naturally much weaker in terms of aura. In the first clash, they relied on their self-confidence, relying on the momentum that the world would avoid whenever they appeared. However, when they truly clashed, they discovered that the 5-star army was much stronger than they had imagined. Their unstoppable momentum, their sharp sabers, and their merciless ruthlessness actually caused them to suffer a small loss in the first clash. Looking at the center of the battlefield, they accounted for 2/3 of the cavalry that were killed. They were like little flowers in a greenhouse, always thinking that they were the most beautiful in the world. However, when they entered the primeval forest, they were lucky enough to see all kinds of beautiful flowers blooming. When they saw flowers that were far more beautiful than them, they naturally had the thought of viewing the sky from the bottom of a well. The clash with the 5-star army also taught the Baiming cavalry a deep lesson. It let them know that apart from the Mongol Empire and the Wala Empire, they were not the strongest cavalry in the world. Once such a thought appeared, it could not be suppressed. If they lost in terms of temperament, their morale would naturally be much weaker. Taking advantage of this time, the 5-star army once again clashed. Looking at the vast number of enemies charging at them, most of the Baiming cavalry could not even open their eyes completely. In addition to the lack of morale, the morale of the army began to fall into chaos. Don't panic, don't be afraid. We will always be the strongest. Everyone, follow me and attack. Sun Hong sensed the change in the mood of the cavalrymen beside him. After he knew that something was wrong, he shouted loudly. Then, without giving the other cavalrymen time to react, he led a dozen of his personal guards, and was the first to gallop out. No matter what, he had led troops for many years and had experience. The more it was like this, the more Sun Hong knew that he could not hesitate. He could not give the soldiers any more time to think. Otherwise, once the morale of the army crumbled, there would be no way to continue fighting this battle. Sun Hong took the lead and charged out. With him leading the charge, many of the Baiming cavalry who were still hesitating followed him. However, they were still one step too late and allowed Sun Hong to become the vanguard. Moreover, there were only a dozen of them in the vanguard. Logically speaking, when cavalry clashed, the general of each side should be protected. After all, if the general was there, the morale of the army would be there. If the general died, the morale would be gone. However, at this time he did not care about that. He didn't dare to stop and wait for the cavalrymen behind him to converge. Who knew if the cavalrymen behind him would also stop if he stopped? Such a move was no different from courting death in a situation where the cavalrymen were charging at him. Sun Hong, who had no choice but to brace himself and charge forward, did his best to avoid the main force of the 5-star army cavalry. He wanted to take a roundabout route and charge past the enemy cavalry. As long as he did not clash head-on with the enemy cavalry, there shouldn't be any danger. Therefore, what happened next was a puzzling scene. With Sun Hong as the vanguard, the dozen or so Baiming cavalry didn't meet the imposing main force of the 5-star army cavalry. Instead, they dodged and charged to the side of the battlefield. This was a clear display of weakness to the enemy. It was even a cowardly action. It was something that the cavalry code of conduct did not allow to happen. It was because once one side did this, they would lose the morale of the army before the battle even began. If that happened, then it would be impossible for them to win this battle. As the commander of the Jian Province Guards, how could a dignified third-grade military general not know this principle? However, did he have any other choice? He was already the vanguard, so he didn't have any more cavalry to protect him. If he continued to clash head-on with the 5-star army cavalry, what difference would that be from courting death? The only thing Sun Hong, who didn't want to die, could do was avoid the enemy's main force. Even though doing this would make others look down on him, choosing the lesser of two evils, for the sake of his own small life, he could only act like a coward. Sun Hong suddenly rushed to the side of the battlefield, indeed allowing him to avoid the greatest risk. However, what he forgot was that there were still more than 1,000 Baiming cavalry behind him. On the battlefield, following the general's banner. Following the general's footsteps would never be wrong. Oftentimes, this was the most appropriate state to adopt under chaos. That was why when Sun Hong suddenly changed directions, the Baiming cavalry behind him also followed suit. They didn't know that Sun Hong feared death and battle. Under the blinding sunlight, they already couldn't see the movements of the distant 5-star army. Those who didn't know any better only thought that this was one of the general's strategies, while all they had to do was follow the general's footsteps. That was why when Baiming cavalry suddenly collectively moved to the side, it was the same as completely exposing one side of their bodies to the 5-star army's cavalry. 1st Battalion Commander Ma Xiangshan, who had originally already prepared himself for a life-and-death battle, when he saw that the enemy cavalry actually didn't face them head-on, instead exposing one side of their bodies to him, how could he let go of such a good opportunity? Raising his arm high, he brought the reinforced 1st Battalion's 6 companies of close to 600 cavalry to slaughter their way over from the side, delivering a heavy blow to the completely unprepared Baiming cavalry, who didn't even have time to turn their horses around. With a raise of his hand and a fall of his blade, over 100 Baiming cavalry were cut down from their horses, also throwing the enemy's formation into chaos. They just couldn't understand how this battle was fought. How did they end up exposing their flanks to the 5-star army's cavalry? Was this really the path General Sun Hong pointed out? No matter what they thought in their hearts, it was a fact that they had suffered heavy losses. Following that, 2nd Battalion Ding Shan's troops and 3rd Battalion Taimur's troops arrived one after another. Again and again they faced the side, causing more and more Baiming cavalry to be cut down from their horses. Countless cries of agony resounded throughout the battlefield. In the end, the war horses still crossed each other. After passing through 3 waves of Baiming cavalry, there were only about 500 cavalry that managed to charge through. On the other hand, the reinforced cavalry only lost a few soldiers in the second wave of charge. Sun Hong had used his wits to avoid the greatest risk. He survived, but because he didn't set a good example, the cavalry under his command suffered heavy losses. When he finally reined in his horse and turned around to look, he saw that there were only 500 cavalry left. His face immediately darkened, and then he panicked, lost, scared, and terrified. He was the commander, a dignified third-rank Baiming military officer. There was still a great future waiting for him. He definitely couldn't throw away his life here at this time. Many thoughts ran through his mind at this moment. As a result, after making a wrong decision, he made a second wrong decision, which was to run. He turned around and reined in his horse, galloping into the sunlight. Sun Hong already didn't have the courage to carry out a third cavalry charge. He didn't have confidence in himself, nor did he have confidence in the cavalry under his command. Right now, what he had to do was immediately hurry back to the Jianzhou Guard, and then tell his superior about the 5-star army's terror. Even if he had to be punished for this, he would accept it. In short, his life could be preserved, and then there would be a day when he could rise again. The 500 Baiming cavalry who had charged out of the 5-star army's formation with great difficulty, saw their own brothers hacked to the ground with their own eyes. While they blamed their main general for his poor command, they also wanted to charge back and get revenge for their comrades. However, they never would have thought that their main general Sun Hong would run away just like that, bringing more than 10 personal soldiers with him. Retreat. Among the 500 cavalry, there were still 3 centurions. After exchanging a single look, they similarly made the decision to retreat. Even though after doing this, even if they returned, they would still be punished, but even Commander Sun ran. So were they still going to stay here and serve as live targets for the enemy? The 3 centurions made the same decision. The 500 cavalry turned around and fled, chasing after Sun Hong's figure. Cowards without balls. After a short rest, when Ma Xiangshan launched his third charge, what he saw was precisely the scene of Baiming cavalry fleeing. After cursing loudly from his horse, he immediately chased after them with the high morale 1st Battalion. Behind him, the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Battalion, and the 2 companies directly under the regiment commander Windseeker also followed one after another. Right now, they had already won this battle. The only difference was how much of a victory they could expand to. If they could capture or kill the enemy's main general, then that would be perfect. However, after all, the enemy had fled a step first, so if they wanted to capture him, it wouldn't be easy. No matter how hard it would be, they should always try. Just like this, on the right side of the battlefield, Baiming cavalry was crazily running at the front. Behind them was a group of 5-star army cavalry following behind. Both sides were getting further and further away from the Liao River. Facing the dazzling sunlight, Sun Hong led a dozen personal guards to run at the front. From time to time, he would turn around to take a look, his face revealing a fortunate expression. Even though this time he acted as a coward, but this kind of method of immediately retreating when he couldn't defeat the enemy still caught the enemy off guard. It seemed like his little life was saved. Sighing in his heart, Sun Hong continuously used the horsewhip to whip his warhorse, wanting to quickly leave the battlefield and ensure his safety. As time passed, the dazzling sunlight wasn't as strong as before. Sun Hong could finally see everything in front of him clearly. Because of this, his eyes widened more and more, because he actually saw a cavalry appear in front of him. In his impression, he definitely didn't send any reinforcements to support him. Then where did this cavalry come from? Could it be the reinforcements sent by Sa Cha River Guards and Tai Ning Wei? Chapter 665. Yes, that must be the case. The thought flashed through his mind and Sun Hong's face brightened up. Reinforcements had finally arrived. Although both of them were 1,000-man guards and the total number of cavalrymen was only around 600, it was still not a problem to use them well. That way, it would be easier for him to escape. The fearful expression on Sun Hong's face was replaced by a hearty laugh. He led the 500 riders to meet the incoming cavalry head-on. The war horses of both sides were galloping forward, and the distance between the two sides was getting closer and closer. When they were only 2 miles away, they could finally see the lineup of the other side. Their faces were still unclear, but from their clothes, they could already distinguish the identity of the other side. Fuck! Sun Hong couldn't help but curse when he saw the enemy's uniform, especially when he saw the 5-star flag fluttering in the wind. Enemy soldiers? Why are there enemy soldiers here? Could it be that the 5-star army predicted that I would be defeated and escape? Of course, it was expected that I would be defeated. I really didn't expect that I would be defeated. Everything was just a coincidence. The enemy was the 3RD Division's 3rd Regiment Spring Sun and Tiger's Main's Independent Cavalry Division's 4 battalions. Not long after they charged out, they were lucky enough to encounter the defeated Zhu Dahai's troops. Naturally, they surrounded them and wasted some time there. Sun Hong thought that after such a long time, the battle would be over and they wouldn't need to do anything else. However, the heavens were really good to them. They encountered another Baiming army. After seeing that it was the Baiming cavalry, Tiger's Mane and Spring Sun didn't care about which division they were from. They were afraid that the enemy would steal their credit and charged forward with their swords drawn. The 2,000 cavalrymen were like cats that saw mice. They were afraid that if they were late, they wouldn't have the chance to kill the enemy. It was actually the 5-star army. Sun Hong's eyes widened and his body trembled. How could there still be a 5-star army here? Since they were so powerful, why didn't they just charge at the first time? If that was the case, wouldn't they be defeated in a single charge? How would Sun Hong know that the number of people in the 5-star army reported by the scout didn't include the people guarding the supplies? Those people were the independent soldiers. They were usually in charge of logistics, but they were elite soldiers on the battlefield during wartime. The reason why they didn't use their advantage in numbers was because they wanted to train the newly formed cavalry and strengthen the 1st and 2nd Regiment. If they came at him with a crushing force, then what was the point of training? Sun Hong, whose heart was trembling, seemed to be frozen in place. Then a soldier beside him shouted, "General, run quickly. They are coming." There were already close to 2,000 soldiers chasing after them, and another 2,000 were coming from the opposite side. How were they going to fight this battle? If they didn't run, what were they waiting for? Run? Where do you think you're going? Sun Hong's entire body seemed to have lost its spirit. The distance between them was too close, less than 2 li. A single charge would be enough to reach the front of the formation. There were also soldiers chasing behind them, so there was no way to run. Sun Hong had completely lost his confidence. After lamenting, he turned around and looked at the 500 soldiers behind him. He shook his head and said, "You guys should surrender. Perhaps you will still have a way out. Remember, don't resist. That will only be a meaningless sacrifice." Sun Hong persuaded his subordinates to surrender because he didn't want them to die like this. This was the only thing he could do as a general. Then, he pulled out the sword on his body, and a bitter smile appeared on his face. Then he slashed his neck. His movements were too fast. Before anyone could figure out what was going on, Sun Hong had already fallen from his horse. His eyes were wide open as if he was expressing the unwillingness in his heart. But in the end he still killed himself. The soldiers under him could surrender, but as the general, he absolutely couldn't do so. He still had his family and family behind him. If he really surrendered to the 5-star army, once the news spread, only his family would be implicated. So he only had one choice: death. Sun Hong died. Without their general, the 500 Baiming cavalry chose to surrender when they were surrounded by the 5-star army. Among them, there were some hot-blooded men who wanted to die for a righteous cause. But before they could pull out their swords and prepare to fight, they were stopped by their fellow soldiers. You may not be afraid of death, but some people were. If your individual resistance angered the 5-star army and they were all killed, then wouldn't everyone be buried with you? In the end, the 500 Baiming cavalry all surrendered. Normally, with 500 surrendered soldiers, everyone should be happy. But no matter how one looked at it, Tiger's Mane, Windchaser and Spring Sun, they didn't have any smiles on their faces. It was clear that they were still depressed because they couldn't kill to their heart's content. When Sun Hong committed suicide, the Baiming camp by the Liao River gradually quieted down. The general of this army, Tang Longtian, was captured and the 30,000 guards commander, Wang Tong, was killed on the battlefield. With the death or capture of their generals, the Baiming army also lost their will to fight. When they saw a large number of 5-star army cavalry surround them, they all threw down the weapons in their hands and chose to surrender. Right now, it was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The summer days were already very long, but at this time, the sky was still very bright. To be able to end the battle so quickly, it was far beyond everyone's expectations. This was 10,000 Ming army, and it was 10,000 Ming army that was prepared. But when faced with 10,000 5-star army cavalry, they only fought for a few hours before being wiped out. From this point, it was enough to prove the strength and terror of cavalry. It also proved how much of an advantage cavalry had when fighting infantry. Clean up the battlefield, check the military supplies, calculate the results, and send someone to inform the 6th young master. Victory at Liao River. 30 li behind the 5-star army's main camp, Battalion Commander Su Yunxing's reconnaissance unit, and the 3rd Division's Battalion Commander Guanzhong were facing off against the Sacha River Guards and Taining Guards 600 Baiming Cavalry. 1,000 Guards Commander Yi La and Taining Guards Vice 1,000 Guards Commander Lu Dai each led 300 Baiming Cavalry on a plain. The 2,000 Guards' faces didn't change much at this moment. They knew that this moment would come sooner or later. Since they had been following behind the 5-star army, they were already prepared for battle. Sir Yi, the enemy cavalry seems to be a bit more than us. Looking seriously at the 5-star army cavalry that appeared 500 meters away, Lu Dai estimated in his heart, and asked 1,000 Guards Commander Yi La, "So what if they have more people? It's just 100 or 200 more cavalry. We brought the world's most elite Nuzan cavalry. What is there to be afraid of?" Yi La's face was full of pride. For Nuzan to be able to become the Baiming Guard's 1,000 guards, he was destined to put in more effort than others. He was also destined to have stronger strength than normal Han army generals. In fact, Yi La did rely on his own bravery to obtain his current position, while the other Qianhu mostly relied on their ancestors to obtain their high positions. He had always been working hard at the lowest level. After many bloody battles, he finally obtained his position. Not only that, as the 1,000 Guards commander of Nuzan, he also used his authority to change his 300 cavalry to Nuzan cavalry. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that the army he led had a glorious battle record of defeating 2,000 bandits. At this moment, they were only facing 800 5-star army cavalry, so what was there to be afraid of? More importantly, he was now wrapped in battle armor. From afar, his entire body was pitch black, and there were no flaws. This was also where his confidence came from when he rushed into the battlefield. Perhaps because Yi La was too confident, or perhaps because he was infected by his confidence, Lu Dai, who was originally a bit worried, calmed down a lot. "Haha, I have long heard that Sir Yi is very brave. To be able to join hands with Sir today is truly a pleasure. Since that's the case, allow me to join hands with Sir. Sir, please hold the formation. I will go test the enemy's strength." Lu Dai wanted to take the initiative to attack. In fact, half of the 300 cavalry he brought were Nuzan cavalry. This was where his confidence came from. Good, this 1,000 guard will watch General Lu display his might. However, please remember, if there is something difficult to deal with, immediately retreat. This general will come to your rescue. Yi La was very satisfied that Lu Dai wanted to take the initiative to test the enemy's strength. This was the Nuzan style. No matter how strong the enemy was, they would not be afraid and would dare to draw their swords. With Yi La holding the formation, Lu Dai was much more confident. He pulled out his saber and shouted to the 300 cavalry behind him, "Brave warriors, our chance to show off has come. Follow this general and charge. Kill." The 300 cavalry formed by Nuzan and Han people roared in unison. Then they waved their whips and dashed toward the 5-star army. In the 5-star army, seeing the Baiming cavalry charging, the battalion commander of the 3rd Division, Guanzhong, laughed loudly. Then, he looked at the calm Su Yunxing and said, "Battalion Commander Su, you are the treasures in the eyes of the 6th young master. For a charge like this, it is better for us, the direct division, to do it." Su Yunxing really wanted to be the vanguard, but when he considered Guanzhong's words, that the scouts were made up of the most elite soldiers, it was indeed a waste of talent to use them in front of a cavalry formation that could easily be damaged. Su Yunxing nodded and said, "All right, please be careful, Battalion Commander Guan." "Haha. Don't worry, Battalion Commander Su. The person who can kill me hasn't been born yet." With a heroic laugh, Guanzhong pulled out his shining saber and waved it forward. "Direct division, follow me and kill." Chapter 666. Kill. Another deafening roar rang out as the 450 cavalrymen of the 5th Star Corps followed behind Battalion Commander Guanzhong. They charged towards the 300 Northern Ming cavalrymen that were swarming over. A cavalry charge was one of the most ancient and bloody ways of fighting. In the process of such a clash, there was not much skill involved. What was needed was the morale of both sides, the strength of both sides, and the strength of both sides. This was often a way of harming the enemy by 1,000, but also harming 800. But even if they knew this, the cavalry charge was still the favorite of many cavalrymen. This was because only this kind of battle could show the glory of the cavalry. This was what true men and warriors should do. The cavalry from both sides were like two torrents as they clashed against each other on the vast plains. Men shouted, horses neighed, weapons clashed, and shouts rose and fell one after another. In just a single clash, dozens of cavalry from both sides had fallen off their horses. At least a dozen war horses were heavily injured by the powerful inertia and fell to the ground. The sounds of the war horses neighing rang in the ears of every cavalry. In this clash, the division's direct subordinate battalions only had a slight advantage in terms of numbers. The casualty ratio on the battlefield was 7-13. They couldn't even kill twice as many people. This made Guanzhong's face turn ugly. "Get ready, charge." Guanzhong once again swung his saber and launched a second attack. Compared to Guanzhong, Lu Dai's face was even uglier. Half of the 300 cavalrymen he brought were Nuzin elite cavalrymen. Not only did they not gain any advantage in this clash, they even suffered a loss. This was something that he couldn't accept. Fortunately, the 13 cavalrymen that died were all elite cavalrymen. There wasn't a single Nuzin cavalryman. Suppressing the anger in his heart, Lu Dai raised his head and looked at the 5-star army cavalrymen charging over. He also waved his saber and shouted, "Kill." Another clash of cavalrymen. This time, both sides were clearly enraged and the casualty ratio increased. More than 30 cavalrymen died, including 3 Nuzin cavalrymen. The direct subordinate battalion lost 20 cavalrymen, and a few were injured. "Charge!" Guanzhong stopped his horse, turned around, and continued to wave his saber. Another charge came from Guanzhong's mouth. Lu Dai also roared as he led his cavalrymen forward. Su Yunsheng, who was sitting on the sidelines, stared at all of this as he quickly assessed the situation. As the commander of the reconnaissance battalion, he had a much better grasp of the situation on the battlefield than Yang Qindong. After all, not every piece of information had to be reported. Some insignificant matters would often be stopped when they were reported to him. This also allowed Su Yunxing to gain a better understanding of the 600 cavalrymen on the other side. Sometimes, the scouts would be equipped with some when they wanted to catch tongues alive. However, there were not many of them. Since Su Yunxing said that tranquilizer bullets could be used at critical times, just this point alone was enough to show how much he valued these hundreds of Nuzin cavalrymen. "Okay, you can use them." Yenda smiled confidently and left on his horse. He called for 100 brothers of the first company to charge into the battlefield with him. Like Su Yunsheng, Yella also looked at the battlefield with furrowed brows. He was very clear about the standard of Lu Dai's 300 cavalrymen. Although their combat strength was not as good as his, They barely had half of his combat strength. However, even with half of their combat strength, they still did not gain any advantage. Instead, they suffered quite a bit. This made him re-evaluate the strength of the 5-star army. It was at this time that he saw the 100 cavalrymen led by Yenda enter the battlefield. Humph. Yella snorted coldly. They want to interfere in the battlefield in front of me. Men, send 100 cavalrymen to test their strength. Su Yinxing did not move. Yella also did not move. Both sides reserved a certain amount of combat strength in preparation for the final battle. Yenda led the soldiers of the first company onto the battlefield. However, they did not intend to help Commander Guanzhong deal with Lu Dai. Instead, they moved towards Yella's troops. When he noticed that the enemy had also sent out 100 cavalrymen, Commander Yenda laughed loudly. Brothers, the enemy has also made a move. Looks like we can have some fun. Come, the commander said, to try not to kill as much as possible. Let's see who can capture more tongues, living and useful enemies. The scouts of the first company immediately became excited. To be able to become a scout, there was no need to mention their skills and horsemanship. Unless they were surrounded by enemies several times their size. Otherwise, even if they could not defeat the enemy, they could still retreat unscathed. And now that it was only one-on-one, there was even less of a difficulty. Many of the soldiers even began to put away their cavalry swords and rub their fists. Since they wanted to capture the enemy alive, the sharp cavalry swords naturally had to be put away. They were all confident in their horsemanship. They believed that they could get close to the enemy without being injured, and then capture the enemy with a single hand. Different from the 3 divisions who had just expanded their forces, the scouts still chose the seedlings of the cold front even though they were expanding from the company to the battalion. In other words, the 100 people who came out to fight this time were all cold front soldiers, and they were all experienced cold front soldiers. Not only were they very good at teamwork, but they were also very good at martial arts. Few people could be their match. And when these 100 cold front soldiers entered the battlefield, it was only a nightmare for the enemy. The moment they saw the Nizan cavalrymen charging towards them, these 100 people began to perform all kinds of horse tricks. Some hid their bodies on the side of the war horse. Some completely climbed on the horse and became one with it. Some only had one foot on the stirrups and were ready to pounce at any time. In short, the 100 cavalrymen performed all kinds of difficult horse tricks. The Nizan cavalrymen were indeed quite capable. Facing the actions of the first company of scouts, many of them also began to play tricks. They also performed all kinds of difficult tricks on their horses, and then quickly closed in on the enemy. Both sides seemed to have a tacit understanding, and that was to try their best not to use their cavalry swords. They wanted to see whose horsemanship was better, and whose horse skills were better. They wanted to see who could capture who in the end. This kind of battle could only be done by those who were extremely confident. Just from this point alone, these 100 Nuzan cavalrymen could be considered elites. The enemy had sent out all their elites and were full of confidence in their own martial arts. A great battle that was similar to catching a thief on horseback was about to begin. In the distance, the horse trap, a way to catch wild horses, and later used to trap the enemy on the horse, attacks. When they got close, it simply became a fight where you grab and I dodge, and I grab and you dodge. All of this happened in the instant when the 2 horses crossed paths. Speaking of lassoing attacks, it was clear that the Nuzan cavalry was better at it. Their lassoing was fast and accurate, and a few scouts were caught because they could not dodge in time or were not used to such an attack. This made Su Yinxing frown as he watched all of this happen. The good thing was that when it came to close combat and capturing people, the scouts were better. They were also used to capturing enemies at close range. Furthermore, to be a member of Cold Vanguard, which one of them wasn't strong and agile? This allowed them to capture more than 10 Jurchen cavalry in a very short period of time, turning the tide of the battle around. Chapter 667. Seeing more than 10 of his men being captured alive, Yella's expression turned ugly. He finally started to take the cavalry of the 5-star army seriously. He originally thought that in terms of horsemanship, The Nuzan cavalry would be the best. Even the Mongol cavalry would be inferior to them. But now, it seemed that he was too arrogant. Attack together. Draw your swords. Seeing that the 5-star army was very strong, the situation would get worse if they continued to fight. Yella did not want to wait any longer. He did not know if Commander Sun Hong and the rest had already started fighting with the 5-star army. What he needed to do now was to meet up with the main force of the army. Yi La unsheathed his saber, and the 200 female cavalrymen beside him did the same. The 200 of them hollered and pressed their legs against the horse's abdomen, charging forward while yelling, "Follow me and stop them." Su Yinsheng, who had been staring at Yella for a long time, had "I knew you would do this" expression on his face. He took the lead and took out the 95 style from his back. Then he mounted his horse and charged into the battlefield. Firing immediately was the new requirement that Yang Qindong gave to the Cold Vanguard soldiers. Since the next step was to fight on horseback, how to steadily fire and hit the target at high speed became the main training direction for the Cold Vanguard soldiers. Some of the requirements sounded easy, but they were quite difficult to fulfill. For example, firing immediately was something that only a few people in the reconnaissance battalion could do. They were able to hit the target while on a moving horse. Coincidentally, Su Yinsheng, as the battalion commander, was a soldier with this level of skill. As the warhorse moved forward, Su Yinsheng held his gun and slowed his breathing. After he got used to the bumpy ride of the warhorse, his right index finger moved slightly. Then a bullet was fired from the gun barrel. The bullet flew straight towards Yi Ladeo, who was waving his saber as he charged forward. He did not hurt anyone because Su Yinsheng thought highly of Yella's ability. To be able to train cavalry that could compete with the scouts, this kind of person was definitely a talent. This was also what the 6th young master needed. Bah! After a very unexpected gunshot, Yi La, who was running on his horse, felt his right arm sink. When he looked up instinctively, his eyes were filled with horror. He didn't know when, but there was a big gap on the sword in his hand, and the blade was about to break. Su Yinsheng, who fired this shot, was also secretly thankful for his luck. After a period of training, after wasting a lot of bullets, he could now hit a target on a moving horse. However, for an object as thin as a blade, the probability of hitting it was still very low. 1 out of 5 shots was already the limit. For this shot to hit, there was more or less an element of luck involved. Su Yinsheng secretly thought that he was lucky, but in Yi La's eyes, it really shocked him. Since the other party was able to hit his saber with a gun, wouldn't it be easier for him to kill him? How could the 5-star army's marksmanship be so good? Where did they come from? After becoming a Chiliarch of Baiming, Yi La more or less had a certain understanding of guns. However, from what he knew, Baiming's guns were extremely low in terms of stability and accuracy. Only the legendary mercenaries of the Duke of Loyalty's mercenaries were truly powerful, and they could fight against 10 or even 100 enemies. Could it be that the other party was using the world's most advanced guns? The thought only flashed through his mind for a moment. Yi La, who had already started his charge, didn't have time to think too much. Although he was indeed frightened, what if the other party was just coincidentally stunned? Moreover, he didn't think that the other party would intentionally hold back when they had the ability to kill him. They didn't have any relationship, so why would they do that? Quick, be careful. They have guns in their hands. We can only gain an advantage if we get close to them. Charge with me. After a short moment of hesitation, Yi La's shout rang out again. At this moment, there was only one thought in his mind, and that was to charge in front of the other party, cut them down from their horses, and then snatch the guns in their hands. That way, he would be able to gain a great merit. The Nuzan cavalry could be said to be built by Yi La himself. He had invested all of his wealth and energy into it. The other people could name these 300 cavalry, and they treated each other like brothers. When he gave the order, they naturally rushed forward and surrounded Yang Qindong's troops from dozens of directions. They were either holding horse ropes in their hands or making a flying action, as if they wanted to capture the 5-star army alive. Interesting. Su Yinsheng, who had fired a shot, saw that the other party had the same idea as him. They actually wanted to capture him alive. He couldn't help but smile and his heart was filled with joy. Obviously, the other party had also taken a fancy to his extraordinary skills, and even his weapon. They wanted to take it for their own use. Since both of them had such thoughts, then let's see whose methods were more brilliant. Come on, prepare the tranquilizer bullets. Don't be afraid of wasting them. As long as we can capture these people alive, I will report back the amount of bullets used. The more he saw the performance of the Nuzan cavalry, the more Su Yunsheng was certain of the strength of these people. They were definitely first-class elite soldiers, especially their horse skills. It was obvious that compared to them, they were even stronger than the Windchaser cavalry regiment. If these people could be used for their own purposes, the mercenary cavalry's strength was very likely to increase by half a level or even more. The sixth young master had once said that talent was always the most important thing. Based on this sentence, they had only used up some tranquilizer bullets. No matter how they looked at it, they had profited greatly. The scouts were still having a headache from the other party's superb performance on the horse. They originally thought that their horse strength was very strong, but when they really compared, they realized that they still had too many shortcomings. When facing such a strong opponent, they couldn't help but feel a little lacking in confidence. Now that the camp commander had given the order to use the tranquilizer guns, they didn't have to worry about killing these elites. At that moment, everyone didn't hold back anymore. One by one, they took out their precious tranquilizer bullets and loaded them into their guns. They skillfully aimed, adjusted their breathing, and fired steadily. This series of actions was done naturally and smoothly. Bang bang bang. Bang bang bang. Gunshots rang out continuously. Without any misgivings, bullets flew out of the barrels and into the bodies and horses of the Nuzan cavalrymen who were trying to get close, and in reality, were indeed very close to them. Originally, everyone still appreciated each other, and wanted to control each other for their own use. This was the reason why they didn't start a fight as soon as they saw each other. But now, suddenly the five-star army started firing. Seeing their trusted subordinates trembling a few times after being shot, they fell to the ground with a plop. None of them could get up anymore. Yella's face started to turn cold, until it was terrifyingly deep. Use the bows and arrows. Don't care so much. Kill, kill. His brothers died, one by one in front of him. Yella's patience and tolerance disappeared at this moment. In exchange, he was filled with endless anger and terrifying murderous intent. Yella was finally serious. He didn't want to capture prisoners of war anymore. He wanted to pay blood with blood. But at this moment, Yella's reaction was still a little slow. Just as he gave the order, the Nuzan cavalry picked up their bows one by one. The number of people who were able to pull the strings of their bows could be counted on two hands. In a very short period of time, Yella, who had lost most of his combat power, led less than 10 Nuzan cavalry to start a counterattack. They also displayed their martial arts on horseback to the extreme. Even in the face of continuous fire, these people relied on their nimble bodies to make all kinds of evasive maneuvers, causing the bullets to miss one after another. At the same time, they were also looking for opportunities to release arrows to counterattack. In a short period of time, 7 scouts had been hit by arrows, falling to the ground after being hit by the arrows or being hit by their horses. Yella only brought less than 10 cavalrymen. To be precise, there were only 9 of them. There were only 10 of them, and the first wave of counterattacks hit 7 of the scouts. The hit rate was 70%, which was a rather high standard. Bang bang bang. Using the short period of time when the enemy finished firing the arrows, another 5 Nuzan cavalry were shot and fell from their horses. Yella, who only had 4 cavalrymen by his side, roared and cursed. Then he turned around and left very straightforwardly. After seeing the accurate marksmanship and powerful firearms of the 5-star army, he knew that it was impossible to win with the amount of people he had now. Since that was the case, he left and remembered this hatred in his heart, and looked for an opportunity to take revenge. Yila wanted to leave, but how could Su Yinsheng allow it? He shouted and gave chase. He himself rode his horse and chased after Yila. Anesthetizing the enemy was only a method. If he really wanted to persuade them to work for him, He knew that all hope fell on the enemy's Chiliarch. As long as he captured this person alive, there was a high possibility of subduing the cavalrymen. Otherwise, the problem would be difficult to solve. With a clear goal, Su Yunxing brought a squad of elite scouts and chased after Yella. A squad of scouts just to deal with a single cavalryman. This was extremely rare in the history of Yang Xie's scouts. It was also destined that Yella would not be able to escape. Yella's horse skills were indeed very good. His horse was also not an ordinary warhorse. It seemed to be psychic. It seemed to know its master's intentions and rushed out of the encirclement of the scouts several times when it was extremely dangerous. Yella's warhorse was well protected. It was covered with a layer of armor, even the head was covered. Although the weight would reduce the warhorse's running speed, because its entire body was covered in armor, it would give a feeling of being unable to attack. Even if the gun hit the armor, it would not be able to penetrate it. However, the powerful recoil made the warhorse feel pain and neighed. Chapter 668. Yi La's face darkened as he felt the rage of the warhorse beneath him. His face was also dark as if he could explode at any moment and kill someone in anger. When he thought of the elite cavalry that he had painstakingly built over the years being killed one by one in such a short period of time, he wanted nothing more than to fight the 5-star army with his life on the line. While he was furious, he was also trying his best to suppress it. He knew that the current situation was not in his favor. If he wanted to fight with his life on the line, he might be able to kill a few opponents, but he would have to leave his life here. Death was no longer something he was afraid of. He was afraid that after he died, no one would be able to avenge him and his brothers, so he could only endure. Under the siege of 10 people, even the chainmail could not protect him. The warhorse kept neighing as it was injured, but he ignored it all. Relying on his black armor and exquisite skills, he commanded the warhorse to charge out of the battlefield. What he saw from the corner of his eyes made him clench his teeth again. It was not for anything else, but because the 5 bodyguards that followed him were also hit by the 5-star army and fell from their warhorses. This time, the 300 riders he had brought with him had all been annihilated, and he was the only one left. This made him even more determined to escape, so that he could rise again and take revenge. Battalion commander, this guy is slippery. His perception is very strong, and our bullets did not hit him. His warhorse is also wearing armor, and his body is also protected by black armor. Our bullets can't penetrate it. What should we do? The accompanying squad leader rode to Su Yunxing's side with a bitter expression. Battalion commander, he is going to charge out. Another vice squad leader in the team suddenly shouted. He looked up and saw Yi La and his horse charging out from the area that the squad leader was guarding. It seemed that he was really going to charge out of the encirclement. Once he got out of here, he would throw away the armor on his warhorse. His speed would greatly increase, and it would be very difficult to catch him. No way, watch this battalion commander. Su Yunxing's expression did not change, and his heart did not panic. He raised the 95 style in his hand, and turned on the burst shooting mode. Then he aimed at the black horse's leg and fired 5 shots in a row. As expected of the battalion commander of the reconnaissance battalion, and as expected of one of the earliest people to follow the 6th young master. After wasting countless bullets, his marksmanship finally reached a certain level. Out of the 5 bullets he fired, 2 of them actually landed on the same area. Although it was not a single spot, both of them were on the right hind leg of the warhorse. When the 2 bullets hit the same area, the result was obvious. Although the bullets couldn't penetrate the horse, each bullet hit the horse's hind leg. In the end, the horse couldn't withstand the force. Its right leg went soft, and it fell to the ground with a plop. Yi La, who wasn't prepared, or perhaps he was very confident in his armor, was thrown out. He was separated from his warhorse and flew 3 meters before landing on the ground. At the crucial moment, Yi La did a forward roll. Just as he landed on the ground, his body had already flown out. Then he continued to run forward for dozens of steps before he suddenly turned around. A bow and arrow appeared in his hand. The black arrowhead flashed with the light of death. He pulled the bow and arrow back to shoot the enemy. Yi La had no choice but to stop. Without the help of his warhorse, how could his speed be faster than those mounted scouts? Since he couldn't escape, he might as well fight. Killing one would be enough, and killing two would be worth it. The strong bow was already drawn, and his killing intent was already locked onto the body of the 5-star army scout. Then his mouth revealed a bloodthirsty smile. But just as this smile bloomed, he felt a sudden pain in his right arm. Then his whole body began to lose strength. His eyes began to dim, and the bow and arrow slipped from his hand. Before he could shoot anyone, he had already fallen to the ground and fainted. More than 200 meters away, Su Yunxing slowly put away the tranquilizer gun. He smiled and said, "Okay, tie them up and bring them back." This time, it could be said that the results were not bad. After wasting thousands of tranquilizer bullets, they captured more than 500 Baiming cavalrymen, including Yi La and Lu Dai. They were personally escorted by Su Yunxing towards the 5-star army's base camp. At the base camp, one by one, the battle reports were sent to Yang Qindong. Beta Persei, who was responsible for delivering the information, had a straight face. Don't think that it was because he had matured and won many battles that he wasn't arrogant. In fact, it was just because he didn't have the chance to go to the battlefield this time that he was in a bad mood. As Yang Qindong's forces grew bigger and bigger, his authority naturally became more and more important. There were not many people who dared to throw a tantrum in front of him, and there might even be none left. Beta Persei must be an exception. When he was happy, he would show it on his face. When he was angry, he would also show it on his face. In other words, as long as it didn't affect his work, his face would express his true feelings at this moment. However, Yang Qindong had never reprimanded him. Maybe it was because he thought it was fun, or maybe he liked Beta Persei's honest appearance. In short, when Beta Persei was angry, he never got angry. Instead, he always looked at him with interest. At one point, Beta Persei couldn't vent his anger. Instead, he would feel embarrassed from being looked at. In the end, his anger naturally dissipated. "Young master, if there's a chance next time, can you let me have some fun? Even Tiger Head is leading troops." After holding it in for a long time, Beta Persei finally couldn't hold it in anymore. While handing over another battlefield briefing, he finally said what was on his mind. Yang Qindong didn't even raise his head as he looked at the battlefield report in his hands seriously. "If you want to lead troops, you can choose a battalion and be a battalion commander first. If you perform well, it won't be difficult for you to become a regiment commander." "Ah, young master," you agreed. Hearing that he could finally lead troops, and a battalion commander at that, Beta Persei's face suddenly bloomed with a smile. "Yes, I agreed. If you agree, you can now hand over to Qiuvi and Dao Zhao's teams and leave." Yang Qindong finally raised his head and looked at Beta Persei, who was standing there foolishly, with a smile on his face. "Okay, no." Beta Persei smiled and kept nodding, but then he seemed to have thought of something and immediately shook his head like a rattledrum. "Beta Persei will follow young master, forever by young master's side." Beta Persei finally reacted. With his experience of following Yang Qindong all this time, being a battalion commander in the army would not be considered an important position. On the contrary, it would be a very normal thing. With his status and experience, even if he were to become a regiment commander, no one would say anything about it. But once he really left the army, it would be very difficult for him to return to Yang Qindong's side. This was definitely something he could not accept. Beta Persei did not forget what kind of role he, Yang San, Yang Si, Yang Wu, and Yang Lu had when they came to Yang Qindong's side. They were the Yang family's servants, protecting the 6th Young Master's safety, and also responsible for some of the Yang family's affairs. This was their duty and pursuit. But now, if he wanted to go to the battlefield, he would have to violate his original promise and goal. This was equivalent to betraying his own life. This was something Beta Persei would not allow to happen. But after a moment of joy, he suddenly thought of these things. He remembered that the 6th Young Master had said that he could leave after handing over his work. Did that mean that he would not be able to come back? Compared to being by the 6th Young Master's side to protect his safety, not to mention being a battalion commander, even being a regiment commander, or a division commander would not be enough to move him. Beta Persei suddenly went back on his word. Yang Chendong's expression did not change, but he asked very seriously. I just said that I agree. If you agree, you can leave now. No, young master, I don't agree. I'm going back on my word. I want to stay by the young master's side for the rest of my life, and protect your safety with my life. Beta Persei said in a resolute tone. Then with a plop, he knelt on the ground and kowtowed. Sigh. Beta Persei knelt on the ground. Yang Chendong shook his head helplessly, then raised his hand and said, Well, since this is your choice, I respect you. Then stay. It's just that I don't want to hear the same words a second time. If you have such thoughts again next time, then just leave. Do you understand? Understood, young master. Don't worry. I won't have such thoughts in my life. Beta Persei kowtowed 3 more times to the ground before he slowly raised his head and breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that the young master was not angry with him for saying these words. It seemed that he needed to go back and reflect on himself. Being able to stay by the 6th young master's side was something that many people wished for. He actually wanted more. He really did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Beta Persei stood up again. Yang Chendong was no longer looking at him. Instead, he placed the battlefield briefing in front of him. Well, take a look. Battalion Commander Su said that this Beiming general called Yella has some skills. You can fight with him later, and find out what abilities he has. As soon as he heard that there was a fight, a smile reappeared on Beta Persei's face. Okay. Please rest assured, young master. I will definitely teach him a good lesson later. The battle was won, and the dispatched troops returned one after another. Yang Chendong rode the white dragon horse, and stood at the gate of the barracks with a group of people to welcome the victorious army. When any army passed by him, they would salute him solemnly as a sign of respect. Smoke was already rising in the barracks. The 2 auxiliary barracks that were left behind had already cooked fragrant food, and were waiting to reward the army. The soldiers who entered the barracks first handed over their spoils of war, the noses of the dead enemies, to the officers who recorded their achievements. Then, they took the silver that had sunk into the ground and happily washed their hands to eat. The barracks was soon filled with people and all kinds of laughter. Chapter 669. In the Battle of Liao River, they killed more than 3,000 enemies and captured more than 6,000 enemies. They also seized countless war horses and various resources. The 5-star army only suffered less than 100 casualties. In the Battle of Cold Weapons, it could already be considered an absolute victory. Troops and prisoners of war entered the barracks one after another, including Su Yunxing's troops. Yella was still unconscious after being hit by the tranquilizer gun. However, his war horse had already recovered and was brought in front of Yang Chendong. Oh, this armor is not bad. Looking at the armor that completely covered the war horse, Yang Chendong's interest was piqued. Yes, 6th young master. This armor is indeed very powerful. Ordinary bullets won't be able to do much damage to it. Su Yunxing stood at the side and described the situation on the battlefield in detail. Yang Chendong nodded his head as he listened. He had a thoughtful expression on his face. Men, bring Wuhua over. Wuhua, the blacksmith who specialized in making saddles and armor for war horses, came in front of Yang Chendong. As soon as he arrived, he didn't wait for anyone to ask him and walked in front of the war horse. He carefully observed it and then touched it with his hands. His face flashed with excitement, like a young lad who saw a beautiful girl. He loved it so much that he couldn't bear to part with it. All right, you've seen and touched it. Tell me, can you make a war horse armor like this? Yang Chendong chuckled as he rode on the white dragon horse. I can. However, it requires a lot of materials. This kind of iron isn't ordinary iron. It has been tempered thousands of times. Let's put it this way. After 100 gene of iron is tempered, it's already not bad if 5 gene is usable. After all, considering the toughness and weight of the iron, there can't be any impurities. Wu Hua, who already had an idea in his heart, turned around and reported to Yang Qindong respectfully. 5%? Yes, that is indeed necessary. Yang Qindong nodded in agreement. Su Yunxing had said that the warhorse's speed didn't decrease significantly because of the iron. This was enough to prove the strength of the iron. This was also the point that he valued the most. Of course, this also meant that a large amount of iron was required to make such armor. Even with Yang Qindong's wealth, it was impossible to equip all the warhorses with such armor. Even though the amount of steel that Crimson Nest City had prepared over the past few years wasn't small, both the weapon factories and the shipyards required an extremely large amount. Not to mention, when Yang Qindong left, there was a new factory, a tank factory, which required even more materials. It was impossible for him to have any spare energy to support the creation of the warhorse chainmail. Looks like I'll have to figure everything out myself. However, the amount of iron needed to build a cavalry of over 10,000 men is also enough to make one sigh. Yang Qindong's thought of equipping all the warhorses was immediately extinguished. Knowing that it was impossible to do it, but insisting on it wasn't a firm decision, but a fool. How about this? Take out all the iron we have. This young master will think of a way to obtain some from the surroundings. It shouldn't be a problem to equip 100-men squad first. Yang Qindong quickly made a decision and his gaze landed on Wuxia. If possible, he planned to equip his 2 guards first. That way, his safety would be guaranteed, and the other officers wouldn't have to worry about him when he went anywhere. The number of security squads on both sides has been expanded from the original 30 to 50 people per squad. As long as there are enough materials, I can lead the blacksmiths to create the chainmail. Wuxia had a face full of confidence. Interest was the best teacher. He had been learning blacksmithing from his father since birth, and now had over 30 years of experience. It wasn't that he wasn't capable enough to produce anything good, but that the conditions and environment didn't allow him to do so. However, if there were enough materials, he was confident that the chainmail he produced wouldn't be inferior to anyone else's. All right, then it's settled. Not only do we have the iron horse chainmail, there's also an impenetrable black armor over there. Let's forge them all, haha. Yang Qindong laughed heartily in satisfaction. Then, he touched the chainmail affectionately and sighed with longing. In the camp, the soldiers had a warm meal, and everyone was refreshed. The commanders of the various battalions and companies also took the opportunity to start targeted training. They were given remedial training based on their performance in the previous battle, so that they could have a better performance in the next battle. The captives were gathered together and given a full meal. When they saw that there was meat in the dishes, and that there was a lot of meat, they actually ate to their heart's content. For a moment, they seemed to have forgotten that they were captives. Yi La and Lu Dai were also among them. When they saw that their subordinates were still alive and wolfing down the food, they couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. In order for the Nuzan tribe to have the ability to protect themselves in the future, although one of them was a Qianhu captain, and the other was a Qianhu vice Qianhu captain, they had been living in poverty all these years. All the money was spent on equipment and training, so they rarely ate meat. The clansmen had never complained. It wasn't that they didn't have any ideas, but that they knew that the hardship they suffered now was so that their clansmen could live a more free life in the future. Now that they had become captives, there was no future for them, so they might as well eat to their heart's content. A trace of tears flowed out of Yi La's eyes. After recalling the scene, he knew that he had let down his soldiers too much. However, at the same time he was very happy. He thought that his brothers would be killed in front of him, and that they would be separated by life and death. He didn't expect that when he woke up his brothers would still be alive. At most, they were a little injured, but not a single one of them had died. This made him very happy, but at the same time, he was very curious about what methods the 5-star army used and how they did it. Yi La and Lu Dai, my young master wants to see you. Su Yunxing appeared in front of the captive camp. After seeing that the two of them had finished eating and had put down their bowls and chopsticks, he shouted. As soon as he finished speaking, the 500 captives all stood up. Regardless of whether they were full or not, they all stood up in unison and glared at Su Yunxing with ferocious gazes. Although they didn't have any weapons in their hands, they still had their fists, legs, and teeth. As long as they were still breathing, they wouldn't let anyone threaten the safety of the two generals. Su Yunsheng saw the collective performance of the Nuzhen cavalry and praised them in his heart. Just from this point, he could see that the two generals should be loved and respected by their soldiers. Wasn't this the talent that the sixth young master needed? All right, I'm not bringing you to interrogate you, not to kill you. Besides, if I really want to kill you, do you think you can stop me? Although Su Yunsheng was very optimistic about the Nuzhen cavalry, his face was still very serious. Before they submitted to the sixth young master, they were still his enemies. Yi La and Lu Dai understood the meaning behind Su Yunsheng's words. Furthermore, they were now under someone else's care. Did they really think that they could not go out just because they wanted to? If they angered the other party, they would only implicate their subordinates. All right, everyone sit down. I'll go out with Chiliarch Lu. Yi La knew that he couldn't make the decision now. Even if he didn't want to, what else could he do? Besides, he also wanted to see who the general of the 5-star army was, and how he could train such a powerful cavalry like Su Yunsheng. With the two generals speaking, although the soldiers still had some complaints, they couldn't say anything. They could only remind the generals to be careful and watch the two of them walk out of the captive camp. On the way to the main tent with Su Yunsheng, Battalion Commander Su whispered to them, "When you see the young master later, please be more respectful. Even if it's not for yourself, for the sake of your brothers and clansmen, please pay attention to your words. Otherwise, no one can save you." Although Su Yunsheng knew that the sixth young master loved talented people, if they relied on their talents to become arrogant and even spoke hurtful words, even if the sixth young master was magnanimous and didn't lower himself to their level, who knew what Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei would do? In front of a group of officers who regarded the sixth young master as a god, anyone who dared to do something provocative would have very serious consequences. Yi La and Lu Dai didn't say anything. They didn't agree or disagree. They just obediently followed behind Su Yunsheng step by step. In fact, only the two of them knew that if the leader of the 5-star army didn't have the ability, then they would never bow their heads. This was the dignity of the strong. Only a stronger person could subdue them. Otherwise, not only would they surrender, they would also have other thoughts in their hearts. It was only a matter of time before they rebelled. After about 2 miles, Su Yunsheng finally stopped and stood in front of a military tent that occupied a large area. As soon as he entered, Yi La felt a murderous aura around him. Lu Dai was a little better. His perception wasn't as strong as Yi La's. He just felt a little uncomfortable. On the other hand, Yi La felt like a lamb that had strayed into the forest and was stared at by a fierce tiger. He couldn't help but become very nervous. About 300 meters away from the military tent, Yang Chendong was watching Yi La and Lu Dai under the cover of another military tent. When he saw the latter lowering his head, he couldn't help but want to look around. The former didn't even raise his head, but his body was tense. It seemed that his body would bend into a bow at any time, and he would make the strongest counterattack at any time. Chapter 670. That's Yi La, right? His reaction is pretty good. Yang Chendong pointed casually and asked Guanzhong, the battalion commander of the 3rd Division. Lu Dai was captured by Guanzhong and his men, so he was naturally clear about the situation of these people. Hearing the 6th young master's question, he cupped his fist and said, "Yes, that person is Yi La." When they captured him, Battalion Commander Su took a full squad of soldiers and spent some effort to capture him. Well, he's someone with some strength. Yang Chendong had heard about these things a long time ago, so there was nothing strange about it. This led to the current move of probing. He deliberately arranged for the Wolf-Fang Special Forces to ambush near his tent in order to put pressure on the opponent and see how Yi La's perception was. After all, if he wanted to become a general who led troops and was trained to be a general who led an independent team, if he didn't even have the ability to perceive danger, then no one would feel at ease handing over military power to him. Knowing that Yi La's strength was not bad, Yang Chendong turned his head and looked at Beta Persei. How about it? If your hands are itchy, go and give it a try. Yes. Beta Persei, who had been impatient for a long time, agreed and walked towards the tent. His tall body seemed to cause a tremor in the ground every time he stepped on the ground. It could be seen that young heir's strength had improved during this period of time. Su Yinsheng, who was still standing in front of the tent, was not in a hurry at all. His task was to bring these two people here. As for what would happen next, it was something he needed to worry about. Yi La and Lu Dai behind him, especially the latter, had been standing there for a long time, but no one came to greet him. This made him very puzzled. He endured it, and was about to raise his head and ask Su Yinsheng how long he was going to stand there. As soon as Lu Dai raised his head, he felt a murderous aura appear beside him. Lu Dai hurriedly turned around and saw young heir, who was only 5 meters away from him. With a height of nearly 1.9 meters and a weight of more than 100 kilograms, no one could ignore him standing there. When Lu Dai saw him, for some reason he instinctively made a defensive move. Beta Persei saw all of this. You. No, my opponent is him. Young heir shook his head in disdain when he saw Lu Dai staring at him with a defensive expression. He spoke in an arrogant tone. No matter what, he was still a vice-chiliarch, and he had the bloodline of the Nuzin clan. When had he ever been looked down upon like this? Lu Dai raised his head and glared fiercely at Beta Persei. He opened his mouth and said, "You're very arrogant, but you have to know that you're not good at fighting just because you're big. If you have the ability, let's fight. I'll let you know the consequences of being frivolous." Arrogant. Young heir laughed out loud. Originally, you weren't qualified enough for me to deal with you. However, since you're so arrogant, then come at me. Let's see who's the arrogant one here. After he finished speaking, Yang Shou hooked his finger at Lu Dai, making a provocative gesture that seemed to be asking for a beating. This gesture was naturally learned from Yang Qindong. At that time, it was this gesture that was so awesome, awe-inspiring and cool. It was also because of this gesture that the first and second guard teams were completely wiped out. Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei were also defeated and lying on the ground. Until now, the Wolf Fang Special Forces were also completely wiped out. This was Yang Qindong's strength. However, no one knew if this was his true strength, because now no one could test the bottom line of the sixth young master. Everyone only knew that once this gesture was made, these people combined were no longer his opponent. Imitating the sixth young master, Beta Persei also made the same gesture, which aroused Lu Dai's anger. Although he didn't know what this gesture meant, the contempt and disdain in Beta Persei's eyes were undoubtedly revealed. Since this was the case, of course he would make a move. He wanted to let this arrogant person know what the consequences of daring to underestimate him were. Aha! With a shout, Lu Dai's feet constantly kicked up dust on the ground. He had just eaten, and was now full of strength. Coupled with his anger, his speed was even faster than usual. After running for 7 or 8 steps, Lu Dai, who had accumulated enough power, suddenly leaped into the air, and smashed his fist down on Yang Heir's head with the force of Mount Tai. Humph! Lu Dai's eyes were fixed on the other party's body. When Lu Dai leaped up, Yang Heir let out a disdainful snort. Then, without any movement, he tilted his head, causing the fist to hit empty air. The fist smashed down on the corner of his clothes. Lu Dai's face did not change in the slightest when his attack failed. Originally, he did not expect this punch to succeed. This was originally a probing move, and the next kick was his real killer move. His body rotated in mid-air, and his right leg kicked out towards Beta Persei's head. The speed of this move was so fast that even Beta Persei could not dodge it. Since he could not dodge, Beta Persei simply tilted his head again, then raised his right arm to block his more vulnerable neck. Clang! The kick landed squarely on Beta Persei's forearm. The powerful force caused Lu Dai's body to tremble, and he retreated several steps. At this moment, there was a trace of pain on his face. This time, he was the first to attack, but when this kick landed on Beta Persei's arm, it was as if he had kicked a thick iron plate. It brought him endless pain, causing the corners of his mouth to twitch. Still want to leave? Seeing that Lu Dai, who had failed in his attack, wanted to land and retreat again after the kick, Beta Persei was not willing to agree. He did not make a move before because he wanted to test the opponent's ability. Now that he knew the opponent's approximate strength, it was time for him to counterattack. With a roar, Beta Persei's right arm suddenly grabbed forward, accurately grabbing Lu Dai's ankle in his hand. Then his body suddenly spun on the spot, forcibly lifting Lu Dai's body into the air. "You can go now." After spinning for more than half a circle, Beta Persei felt that Lu Dai's entire body was spinning with his body. He suddenly loosened his grip, and the figure flew forward like an arrow. Puff! After about a breath's time, Lu Dai's entire body was smashed to the ground. At that moment, he felt as if all the bones in his body had fallen apart, and there was nothing but pain. This was because Beta Persei had controlled his strength. Otherwise, this throw would have smashed him to death. After Lu Dai was thrown out, Beta Persei regained his footing. He clapped his hands and said with an indifferent look, "Okay, the noisy person is gone. Now you can fight with me." His gaze fell on Yila. Beta Persei clenched his fists, producing a creaking sound. Yila saw the scene just now from the beginning to the end. Because of this, he did not dare to underestimate Beta Persei. On the contrary, he was constantly evaluating him in his heart. In the end, he shook his head and said in an unwilling and sad tone, "I'm not your opponent." Oh, Beta Persei, who was preparing for a big fight, suddenly froze after hearing Yila's words. This was inconsistent with the task given by the young master. After thinking for a while, he turned to look in the direction where Yang Chendong was standing. At this time, Yang Chendong was striding over and happened to hear Yila's answer. Compared to other people who would show a look of suspicion or even contempt, Yang Chendong's expression did not change. On the contrary, if one looked carefully, there was a trace of joy. In this era, people who could ride horses on the battlefield all boasted that they were men. Each and every one of them had their eyes on the top of their heads. When it came to a bloody battle, it was about who had more people, who had more strength, and who dared to fight to the death. On the contrary, there were very few people like Yila who admitted that they were inferior to others in terms of strength. But because there were very few of them, it was abrupt and even looked down on by most people. As a northern Ming guard 1,000 households, admitting defeat before the battle was naturally a sign of cowardice in their eyes. It was a cowardly act. This Yila doesn't seem to be as strong as Battalion Commander Su said. Tiger's Mane was the first to assert. Not only him, but the first guard captain Xiu Vi and the second guard captain Dao Xiao also nodded in agreement. It's important to know one's own name. This is the ability that a commander should have. Without waiting for others to mock him, Yang Chendong suddenly opened his mouth. Instantly, Tiger's Mane and the others' expressions changed. The laughter that was about to come out was stuck in their throats. Ignoring the wonderful changes in the expressions of the people around him, Yang Chendong strode in front of Yila and looked at him with interest. "Well, you admit defeat before the battle. Do you know that people will look down on you if you do this?" Yang Chendong did not reveal his identity, so Yila did not ask. But he could still see that although the person who asked the question was young, he was indeed surrounded by people like the stars around the moon. His identity must not be simple. Out of politeness, he replied, "It doesn't matter if people look down on us or not. We live for ourselves, not in the eyes of others." Interesting. Hearing this answer, Yang Chendong seemed to be even more interested. "But I don't know why you admitted defeat directly. Don't you have the courage to even try?" Yila had already said that he did not want to live in the eyes of others, but Yang Chendong brought up this matter again. Yila was too lazy to answer. He turned his head away and looked like he was unwilling to answer. This was heard by Su Yinsheng, who was standing at the side. He was afraid that the sixth young master would be angry, so he quickly whispered, "Yila, don't be arrogant. This is our sixth young master, and also the great Ming's loyal duke." Chapter 671. Su Yinsheng was aware of Yi La's abilities, so he reminded him out of kindness. However, Yila didn't seem to appreciate it. "What do you mean by don't be arrogant? What do you mean by our sixth young master?" He's clearly yours, okay? And what about the great Ming's loyal duke? What the hell is that? Loyal duke. Ah. Loyal duke? Yella, who was half a beat slower in reaction, changed her expression and looked at Yang Chendong again. She then asked with a shocked expression. What did you say? Did you just say that you're the Duke of Loyalty of the great Ming dynasty? Are you the war god's loyal duke? It was no wonder that Yi La was so shocked. Although New Ergon Dusi was far away from Baiming's capital, they had heard about the war god's continuous victories and how he forced the Walla's army to retreat. The female Jinren prided herself as the strongest person in this era, so she naturally respected the strongest people. When he heard the news, he had thought more than once that he must meet the war god if he had the chance. He didn't expect that his wish would come true today. Yi La stood in front of Yang Chendong in shock. His eyes kept looking at Yang Chendong. He found that the god of war was very young and had a scholarly aura. He didn't seem to know any martial arts at all. Was he really the god of war? He didn't know that Yang Chendong could hide his murderous aura under the nourishment of the qi. He had reached the realm of returning to his original state. Unless he wanted to let the other party know. Otherwise, no one would be able to tell how much power was contained in his seemingly scholarly body just by looking at his appearance. There's no need to look. If you're talking about how I defeated the Walla, then I'm the war god you're talking about. Yang Chendong squinted his eyes and smiled. You are really the god of war, but they say that the god of war has 3 heads, 6 arms, a height of more than 1 zhang, and arms as thick as an ordinary person's thigh. Yi La spat out all the words he had heard in the rumors. Ha 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 ha. Yang Chendong couldn't help but laugh when he heard Yi La's description of himself. Not only that, but Tiger's man, Beta Persei, and the others also laughed. They had been with the 6th young master for the longest time, so they naturally knew what kind of person the 6th young master was. After laughing for a while, Yang Chendong finally stopped laughing when he saw the doubt in Yi La's eyes getting heavier and heavier. He said, You're saying that I have 3 heads and 6 arms, right? But in fact, I am a very normal person, just like all of you. But you should also know that even if it is a legend, if it is not exaggerated, who would be willing to listen to it and believe it? In the last sentence, Yang Chendong told the truth. There was always no lack of exaggeration in history. It seemed that when you said that a person was very powerful, you had to exaggerate infinitely. This had become a law. But in fact, those famous people in history had only 1 head and 2 shoulders. Before they became famous, they were no different from ordinary people. Yi La also laughed at this time, but it was an awkward laugh. He was a smart person, but he was still misled. This was enough to show how powerful the legend was. Even he had to believe it. Seeing Yi La's forced smile, Yang Chendong casually waved his hand, indicating that he didn't want to talk about this topic anymore. He then said, I heard from Battalion Commander Su that you and the Nuzan cavalry you lead are very strong, but I don't know why you train so well. Don't say that this is your duty. This young master has already understood that your salary and some gray income is invested in the cavalry. This is not the duty and responsibility of a Qianhu. Yi La had already recovered from the shock. When he heard Yang Chendong's question, he bitterly smiled and said, Before this, I was very confident in my cavalry. But after this battle, I can't say that they are very strong. I am now a captive. As for why I did this, I don't dare to lie. I was just used to being bullied and didn't want my descendants to be inferior. Well said. When Yang Chendong heard the last sentence, he didn't want his descendants to be inferior to others. Yang Chendong was quite emotional and cheered loudly. Of course, he wouldn't tell Yi La that 100 years later in history, the Nuzan people were so powerful that they enslaved the entire Han people for 268 years. They truly fulfilled the fact that their descendants were not inferior, and were even superior. Since he knew that the Nuzan people had ambitions and was met by Yang Chendong, of course, he had to strangle this ambition in the cradle. And for insurance, of course, it was best to take them in as his subordinates and keep a close eye on them. Yi La, right? This duke wants to take you in as his subordinate. What do you think? Don't worry, under my command, the Nuzan people can live very freely. As long as they are obedient, they won't have to worry about food and clothing. Living a happy life is not a problem. Yang Chendong made a promise and stared at Yi Lei's body. At this time, the Nuzan people were still very weak. Not to mention the great Ming dynasty, they were even much weaker than the Mongols and Wala. Yang Chendong was willing to help them at this time. This was naturally what Yi Lai wanted. Yi Lai, who didn't know what the future would be like, was moved by these words. He was even more clear that if he didn't agree now, he, who was originally a captive, might not even have the chance to see the sun tomorrow. With a plop, Yi Lai knelt on the ground and kowtowed 3 times to Yang Chendong. Yi Lai is willing to lead the Nuzan people to submit to the Duke of Loyalty. I will not regret it until I die. The news of Yang Chendong leading a powerful mercenary army to destroy the Jiaoji and Lansong kingdoms in the south had already spread to the new, Ergon City department. As a Qianhu, Yi Lai had the right to know these things. In his heart, he didn't know how much he envied the strength of the mercenary army. Now that he had the chance to see Yang Chendong himself, he finally made the decision to submit. In his opinion, this decision was the right one, at least for now it was the right one. After accepting another general, Yang Chendong smiled happily. He didn't think that as soon as he revealed his aura, everyone would bow down to him. He was very clear that the reason why Yi Lai submitted to him was because he saw that he was stronger than him. It could even be said that it was a temporary measure. But it didn't matter. Since he had already submitted, Yang Chendong was confident that he wouldn't let him leave again. If he had to say where his advantage was now, other than the unknown and mysterious warehouse, he should be left with money. With the foundation of Qiqian City, there were so many novel things that were sold at high prices. There was even a price but no market. He never lacked money. With money, he could buy people's hearts. As long as he didn't do things that hurt people's hearts, it would be difficult for people who followed him to follow others. This thought flashed through his mind. Yi Lai stood up and followed beside Yang Chendong, starting to patrol the camp together. This was also the first time Yi Lai saw the strength of the 5-star army. When he found out that General Sun Hong's 10,000-strong Northern Ming army had been defeated and captured, and that not a single soldier had managed to escape from the battlefield, his face revealed an extremely shocked expression. Yi Lai was also a proud person. The biggest characteristic of such a person was that he was conceited and didn't want to admit defeat. In his opinion, if he had enough military strength and wealth, he would definitely be able to win. At least, when facing an opponent with similar numbers, he would definitely not lose. However, he had to admit that no matter how conceited he was, if he wanted to use only 600 cavalry to face Sun Hong's 5,000 cavalry, 5,000 paces, he still didn't have the slightest chance of victory. Yang Chendong did it. Although this was because he had more than 10,000 soldiers in his hands. However, on such an intense battlefield, to not let a single person escape, and to absolutely seal off the news, this still shocked him. At the very least, it would be very difficult for him to do this. Seeing Yi Lai's shock, Yang Chendong said with a smile, "There's no other way. I am the Duke of Loyalty personally conferred by the Baiming Emperor. It's best not to spread the news of me beating my own people." Yi Lai couldn't help but tense up. That's right, this is the Duke of Baiming. However, even though you knew this, you still didn't hesitate to make a move. I'm afraid you already know what you are thinking in your heart. Of course, this was just a thought in his heart. Right now Yi Lai was still a prisoner. Although he said that he had surrendered, who knew if it was true or not? Since he was a newcomer, there were some things that couldn't be said carelessly. While patrolling the barracks, the two chatted. As they talked about the warhorse uniform. Yang Chendong didn't intend to hide anything. He said that he was very satisfied with the impenetrable armor, and wanted to imitate it to make some. He also asked about some things that he should pay attention to. There was no secret about the warhorse uniform. This was something that anyone could make after accumulating a certain amount of wealth. It was just that most people didn't have the courage to do so. Yang Chendong wanted to make one, and this one alone was more than 100 sets. Yi Lai was shocked again, but at the same time, he couldn't help but think that this was what it meant to be rich. He didn't even know how much time it took to make a set of his own, but he did it just like that. It was good to be rich. This wasn't a secret to begin with. and he could use this opportunity to express his loyalty. Yi La said that he would look for the blacksmith in the army later, and tell him some of the problems he would encounter when making the warhorse uniform. He would try his best to avoid some common mistakes and take fewer detours. Very good. Yang Chendong nodded approvingly. He looked at the barracks on the left and pointed casually. Let's go over there and take a look. Yi La, who was following beside Yang Chendong, naturally nodded in agreement. He only thought that Yang Chendong was showing off his strength and martial prowess, so he didn't think too much about it. However, when he entered the barracks, his expression was no longer as calm as before. At this moment, his face was full of shock. Of course, ever since he had followed Yang Chendong for less than an hour, he had been shocked so many times that he had probably forgotten how many times he had been shocked. You're tuning into the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.